the new nationalist faces at the time of the proclamation of the unification decree. Sufier had just arrived in Salamanca. He at once gained an ascendancy over the general that never slackened. He was small but quite strong, very correct, even elegant in his dress. He was remarkable for his prematurely white hair, his quick gestures, and his perpetual state of excitement. Very highly strung, switching from one extreme to another, at times charming and eager to please, at others brusque and even rude. He had studied at the Spanish Institute in Bologna. An able lawyer, he had lived for a long while in Saragossa. His relations with Franco dated back to his marriage, because the two men had married sisters. At the time of the uprising he had been in Madrid. His political views he had belonged to the CETA, and his family relationship with the leader of the uprising made him one of the most direct targets of the popular revolution. He was arrested, incarcerated in the model prison, and then transferred to a clinic on Araujo's intervention. He then managed to take refuge in a legation, probably the Dutch legation. With the help of the Argentine ambassador, he boarded the Tucumán for Marseilles. But his two brothers had not been so fortunate, and Sufier still harbored resentment toward England over their deaths, responsibility for which he partly attributed to the British embassy's bad faith. A pupil of the Jesuits and an uncompromising defender of the Church, he remained deeply marked by his Catholic education. Friendly to Germany, he still preserved a certain mistrust of Hitler, whose policy of hostility to Christianity offended him. Also, he was regarded more as a friend of Italy, and with good reason. Outspoken, violent, a pocket Robespierre. All those who had dealings with him were agreed in calling him a fanatic. His mysticism, his hatred of the liberal spirit and consequently for the democratic system were other features of his character. His admiration for authoritarian regimes and especially for fascism led him to steer clear of monarchist elements, whose moderation he criticized. His friendships had always been most eclectic. He was on good terms with certain traditionalist leaders such as Rodezno and Sáenz Rodriguez, but he was also a personal friend of José Antonio and got along well with the new leaders of the Falange, Amado and Hidilla. His political evolution had impelled him to propose the idea of a permanent regime, led by Franco as head of state. Although he was not categorically opposed to the restitution of the monarchy, he no longer envisaged an immediate restitution. In 20 years' time, Spain might need a king. In the meantime, it is highly probable that he encouraged his brother-in-law in the establishment of a personal dictatorship. With the formation of the new government on February 1, 1938, Suner's ideas seemed to be in the ascendancy. He was Minister of the Interior, Minister of the Press and Propaganda, and he became the new regime's theoretician. The most politically inflexible leaders of the monarchists and the Falange were not in the cabinet. On the other hand, there were 5 soldiers among the principal ministers. There were 3 posts for technicians, and General Jordana was foreign minister. Sufier, who did not care for him, dubbed him a liberal, while Hayes called him a traditionalist. He was friendly to England. General Martínez Anado was in charge of public order. It is usual to see him rather than Sufier pictured as the true leader of the repression in nationalist Spain, although political responsibilities, and especially police measures, sometimes lay with the Minister of the Interior and sometimes with the Minister of Public Order. This state of affairs, moreover, gave rise to hostility between the two men, equally authoritarian in character. Ministerial meetings in 1938 were enlivened by this quarrel. The other ministers were technicians rather than politicians. Andrés Amado, Calvo Sotelo's former collaborator, was finance minister. Swanzes, a naval architect, was Minister of Industry and Commerce. Soldiers and technicians were at loggerheads because of their personalities and their political views. In addition, the formation of the ministry was another step toward dictatorship by General Franco. Indispensable reforms had in fact to be imposed on monarchist opponents. The first government message was a reminder of the urgency of social change and proclaimed the need for a trade union organization combining employers, technicians, and workers. On the other hand, it was time to inform the Phalangists that the revolution was a danger and that Spain had to revert to her great traditions. Everyone had to be told that the moment had come to rebuild the state. In everyone's view, the Caudillo had to be the head of this movimiento and the reorganizer of the country. On July 19, 1938, a decree gave Francisco Franco the imposing title of Captain General of the Army and the Navy. This title meant nothing in itself. Its value was purely symbolic. In Spain, it had been granted only to kings. It made anyone who received it a veritable uncrowned sovereign and set the seal on the general's political victory. 2 years after the 1936 pronunciamiento, Franco became the successor to the Catholic kings. Superiority of arms had brought him close to the total domination of the country. On July 20th, he stated, "We have won the war," but it was in vain that he spoke of a fruitful peace and the disappearance of privilege. It did not seem as if his government's efforts would be sufficient to rally its opponents. "It is not enough to win," said Miguel de Unamuno. "We must convince." Chapter 18. The Organization of the New State. A few words keep recurring in the basic texts of the National Syndicalist state: authority, hierarchy, and order. These terms, and the presence of the army and of officers in every branch of the administration, remind us that the caudillo was a soldier and intended, in Marcot's words, to instill the state with a discipline similar to that of armies. Once the early days of excitement and color were over, observers agreed in recognizing that nationalist Spain wore an appearance of calm and even, in certain regions, of peace, inconceivable at that time in Republican Spain. The maintenance of law and order, it was astonishing to note this peace and calm in areas like Andalusia and Extremadura, which had been more red than most before July 1936. Without doubt, the repression of the revolutionary unrest here had been particularly bloody. But violent and sporadic measures did not usually succeed in crushing every visible form of opposition. To achieve this, it would have been necessary to set up an actual organization for repression. The nationalists first destroyed the cadres of Republican or revolutionary opposition. Steps had been taken to render harmless all individuals regarded as dangerous, christened, somewhat oddly, as rebels by the military leaders. As in Republican Spain, there had been a switch where repression was concerned from organized terror to a semblance of justice. Bahamonde gave a good description of this evolution, which progressed from mass shootings at the outset to summary procedure, then, after February 1937, to systematic action by war councils. The latter were competent to judge offenses of rebellion, sedition, resistance, and disobedience to authority, a definition already dangerous in its vagueness. The few details provided only made it all the more fearsome. Thus, sentence could be passed not only on those in possession of firearms, but, for instance, on those who interfered with the freedom to work, or who spread tendentious news likely to affect the prestige of the army. Any person who insulted or attacked a soldier or an official was liable to punishment. It is true that this was merely the tenor, while it is only the effect that should interest us. But in nationalist Spain, repression was in fact a daily reality. "We shall be pitiless," Quipo stated, "to murderers who have sacrificed women, children, and old people to political fury. As for members of the Republican Union Party, they are too close to the Popular Front to be treated separately." Thus all those who had supported the Republic at some point after July 18th, however briefly, were threatened. Even if they later rallied to the nationalists, because it did not necessarily guarantee them impunity. The former deputy, Rosado Gil, who had been unfortunate enough to ask for a vote of confidence in the Madrid government on October 1, 1936, was sentenced to 3 months' imprisonment for this crime, although he had fled to nationalist Spain a few months afterward. Even some supporters of the movimiento, whose attitude was regarded as subversive, were hounded down. In July 1938, the Marquis de Carvajal had his property confiscated by the Saragossa courts for defeatism. Furthermore, in the above-mentioned cases, only minor crimes and comparatively moderate punishments were involved. Imprisonments and executions followed on each other's heels, and the repression, often accompanied by violence and torture, gathered steam under the regime established by the Minister of Public Order, General Martinez Anido. This earned him many attacks, especially from the Camisas Viejas, but his death did not put an end to these measures. Sentences, purges, and surveillance were stepped up and persisted after the end of the war. It was only in January 1939 that the Law on Political Responsibility was published, which was meant to eliminate the political failings of those who had contributed by acts of commission or omission to aiding or abetting Red subversion. It sought to repress not only acts committed during the Civil War, but also those during the preceding period by members and leaders of unions, parties, and lodges. Thus, those who had organized the 1936 elections, those who had been candidates for the government in the 1936 Cortes, and those who, from 1934 to 1936, had contributed to subversion in a general way were regarded as liable. Such offenses, which were subject to punishment ranging from prison to the confiscation of property, were to be judged by a special court known as the National Tribunal for Political Responsibility, which did not interfere in any way with the work of the war councils. Purges and surveillance. The purges were equally radical. These were aimed especially at the officials who had not rallied to the movimiento. In the area under the immediate control of the nationalists, the problem was solved in a simple way. The new authorities gave orders to all agents of the state who were not in their assigned spots to present themselves to the military authority nearest their homes. Those who did not do so were regarded as rebels. Elsewhere, purges were carried out as new conquests were made. For instance, after the occupation of Biscay, a decree on July 3, 1937 temporarily suspended all teaching staff. Those who wished could apply to the rectorate of Valladolid for reappointment. All they had to do was to fill in forms on which they indicated the offices that they had held under the Republic, the political groups or parties to which they had belonged, and the names of persons who could thoroughly vouch for their attitude. At the end of the war, the purge of officials was extended and generalized. To fall foul of the law, it was enough to have exercised functions unrelated to administrative activity, to have accepted exceptional promotion, or merely not to have supported the uprising to the best of one's ability. The measures that established the system of constant and total surveillance of the population were too numerous and too disparate to be summed up in a few words. Identity cards were compulsory over the age of 16, a usual measure in authoritarian regimes. The formation of an identification department was especially helpful to the police force, or rather to the police forces, because along with the old civil guard, the segregated security police continued to exist, as well as the secret police. Shortly after the formation of the single party, the Phalange had its own police force too. It was difficult to elude such a sizable police apparatus. The measures of surveillance did not merely affect individuals. They were extended to all the means of disseminating propaganda and information: radio, cinema, and especially the press. The war emergency law had already put a ban on the use of radio transmitters and permitted the establishment of a censorship, in theory exclusively military. Gradually, national censorship became organized. 2 commissions were in operation by May 1937, in Seville and in Corunna. They included representatives from the military authorities, but also, which is a fair indication of the scope of its powers, delegates from the Society of Authors, film companies, cultural centers, and heads of families. These initial arrangements were completed by a series of measures aimed at controlling the production of films, books, and newspapers. The Minister of the Interior, through the civil governors, was responsible for the censorship of films. On December 23, 1936, the publication and circulation of pornographic, Marxist, and disruptive books and printed matter was banned. The press was even more dangerous because of the daily influence it wielded over the masses. Moreover, General Franco had always allocated an especially important role to the Delegation for the Press and Propaganda, whose aim was to use the press to publicize the characteristic features of the movimiento, its work, and its future potential. The head of the press department ran the censorship and acted as a link with the newspaper publishers. The latter became true wielders of power. In practice appointed by the Phalange, they were responsible for everything and could be removed and even struck off the register for a single mistake. Also, the information distributed in nationalist Spain was strictly controlled in advance of publication. As a result, it is just as well not to attach too much importance to enthusiastic descriptions made at this period by journalists in political sympathy with Franco, who in reality were content with information provided by the press office intended for foreign journalists. It was easy to find clouds on the horizon. Seville had the look of a peaceful city, wrote Antonio Bahamonde, but convoys of wounded were arriving at night, and to spare the population a painful spectacle, Quaipo had the alert sounded during this period. In October 1937, traffic was halted after 8 p.m. at the very gates of Seville. The guerrilleros continued to hold out for a long while in Andalusia and were still taking huge risks. Bahamonde mentioned an attack on the civil guards in broad daylight. In May 1938, although pacification seemed almost complete, Storer noted similar activities near Cáceres and in Asturias. In the same report, the German ambassador estimated the share of the population in nationalist Spain which he regarded as politically unstable at 40%. The omnipotence of the nationalist authorities could not wholly conceal the opinions of certain groups in the population who were in sympathy with the Reds. It is difficult to make out to what extent the civilian and military authorities with the task of maintaining order cooperated with or thwarted each other. In the areas near the front, the problem did not arise. All power was in the hands of the military. The civilian delegates appointed and installed by the officers remained mere subordinates. Later on, when the region had been pacified, the functions were gradually handed back to civil governors, to established control commissions, or in certain cases, to mayors who had been able to perform their duties. In theory, the civil governors were responsible to the Minister of the Interior. In reality, they had to deal with the military authorities who were still further up in the hierarchy and for a long while preserved sole responsibility for public order. The military had the right to evaluate the lack of ability or the moral errors of the civilians and to replace them, when they felt it absolutely necessary, by a delegate for public order. Moreover, the lack of reliable officials often meant choosing civil governors from the officers. In Malaga, for instance, after the nationalist victory, the civil governor was Captain Garcia Alft, who gave the Italian troops free rein and demonstrated his political views in a spectacular fashion by wearing the uniform of the Phalange. It was natural, in such circumstances, that the only genuinely respected power was the army and that there were clashes between the civilian and military authorities. Apart from the application of the measures decreed by the government, the major preoccupation of the civil governors and the local administrations was feeding the army and the population. This was, however, easily accomplished, since the shops were always full and the stores even had English cloth on sale. Only rice, tea, and coffee were rationed in 1937 to 1938. The nationalists were even able to export part of their farm produce and still maintain reserves. But they fell rapidly after the occupation of the large cities. After the fall of Barcelona, it became necessary to feed a population that had been undernourished for months. Economic problems were far more awkward once the war was over. Prices had risen during the Civil War but had maintained a reasonable level. Every increase had to be authorized, and it was quite common to see a shop closed for contravening the price laws. In this way, the authoritarian regime prevented the living standards of the population from falling too low. Obviously, it did not inhibit all speculation. According to Cormont, who was wholly on the side of the nationalists, the price of cloth took a great leap, and between October 1936 and May 1938 beef went up 37% and wine 48%. Moreover, in spite of the apparent plenty, the regime remained one of austeridad, officially explained by the demands of the war economy. In order to publicize the sacrifices made by everyone to the common cause, the regime invented this single-course system. On Fridays, at the beginning of the war, and then on Thursdays, everybody had to settle for a one-course meal. Yet, in practice, how could such an institution be controlled? It must be granted that this was all very utopian, except, of course, for those who ate in restaurants, who also had to agree to go without dessert on Mondays. In fact, this was a question of Platonic demonstrations, intended mainly to impress foreigners who would thereby be convinced of the discipline and voluntary sacrifices of the country at war. The poverty of the population was the real cause of austerity. The calm and prosperity was therefore only a facade. For those who genuinely wish to understand the new state, it is necessary to examine its institutions in detail. The National Syndicalist state, apart from the officers, whose loyalty and discipline were precious to Franco and who were indispensable, the new cadres of the political system were supplied by phalangists from the single party. This was the National Syndicalist state's blue period. The Phalange was the inspiration and basis of the Spanish state, according to the first sentence in its articles, which reiterated and set out in detail the principles of political morality enunciated in the April 19th decree. Individual interests had to bow to the service of the state, social justice, and the Christian freedom of the individual. Thus, to the concept of political and social freedom, about which there was no longer any question, was opposed the principle of Christian freedom, which was simply a moral freedom. What counted, in fact, was respect for the fatherland's eternal values and the social hierarchy. This notion of hierarchy inspired every party organization, from local phalanges to the Caudillo. The national leader of the movimiento had, as we saw, the real power. It was he who chose the members of the First National Council, appointed the president of the political junta, and named 5 of the 10 national councillors who took part in it. He was the supreme head of the phalange militias, selected and dismissed the provincial leaders, and decided on regional inspections. He had the supreme power of both decision and appeal. The political junta was therefore only a council with political powers in the view of the national leader. It met at least once a month, to study the proposals to be made to the head of state and to examine the accounts of the movimiento. Orders were handed down from the top, from the junta or the national council, to provincial commanders and local phalanges. A local phalange was made up of at least 20 militant associates. There could be no question of everyone who applied being admitted into the party. But neither was goodwill to be discouraged. Hence the distinction between supporters and militants, which irresistibly brought to mind the organization of certain religious orders, and especially that of the Jesuits. The supporters were not members of the phalange. However, they had to subscribe to the formula of membership and allegiance established by the National Jefatura and to pay dues. The title of militant was given to supporters who had 5 years membership, to former members of the phalange and the recruits, and to generals, officers on active duty or serving in combat, as well as to those who obtained this title through a personal decision by the Caudillo or through a proposal by the provincial Jefaturas. Each section had a similar hierarchy, with a local leader, a secretary, a treasurer, and a local head of militias. In the large towns, the municipal Jefatura had under its supervision heads of districts, sub-districts, blocks, and houses. In this way, a network was set up from which there was no escape, which was more efficient than any police force. The phalange was, in every field, the instrument of totalitarian power. It existed under every form, such as women's movements and youth movements, flechas. It led the youth in the universities by creating the Sindicato Español Universitario, a single, compulsory student organization, meant to instill the intellectual profession with a deeply Catholic and Spanish feeling. Like the phalange, it was organized on a hierarchical basis, with a national leader appointed by the Caudillo and invested with supreme authority at its head. Apart from the students who were normally part of the SED and who paid their dues, subscribed to the rules of membership which implied unconditional obedience, and wore the 5 arrows and the yoke, emblems of the phalange, there were 2 unusual categories of associate member, honorary members who, without being students, had contributed through intellectual work to Spain's greatness, and patrons, who had helped the development of the SED with gifts or financial aid. From 1938, the Falange state became the National Syndicalist state. The Suyer group, which included in the government Fernández Cuesta, Amado, and the Minister for Trade Union Affairs, González Bueno, felt that it was not possible to abandon the positive side of the Phalangist program. First, they wanted to obtain an affirmation of principle. The new state had to demonstrate its social vocation to everyone. The labor charter, in fact, began with a twofold statement. Work will be required of everyone, but everyone has the right to work. It also contained a number of promises. The length of the workday was not to be excessive. Married women would be freed from the workshop and the factory. A public holiday would be created that, in contrast to the Reds I May, would be on July 18th, anniversary of the Glorious Uprising, and would be called the holiday for the glorification of work. There was even mention of holidays with pay and institutions for workers' leisure hours. However, it is necessary to note the extremely vague nature of these provisions. For instance, at what point can the working day be regarded as excessive? The text mentioned holidays with pay but did not fix their length for the time being. Later on, there was talk of a week, but it had still not been granted in 1938. The war provided an excuse for putting off social achievements. In the meantime, some of the advantages gained were lost. The work week in metalworks, ironworks, and factories making electrical and scientific equipment rose from 44 to 48 hours, and in the Huelva mines in the first 6 months of 1938, the work week was increased by an hour. Also, without dwelling on the hypothetical benefits granted to the workers by the Furo del Trabajo, it is necessary to consider the deep-seated principles that had guided the legislators in the Phalange National Council. Cormont recalled that, The state's national syndicalist organization is inspired by the principles of unity, totality, and hierarchy. We shall merely follow his analysis of the charter and of the formation of vertical trade unions. The principle of unity meant that, outside the trade union, there is nothing. Joining a union was in fact compulsory. The issue of union cards, a phalange monopoly, was, in the hands of the single party, an important new means of control. The totalitarian idea was clear from the union's very organization. All productive forces are united. In fact, in contrast to the affirmation of the class struggle that was at the basis of Marxist materialism, the national syndicalist state claimed to have overcome the differences between social categories. Moreover, the union was to group employers, employees, and technicians in the same bodies. The unions were, in fact, strictly hierarchical. All union groups are subject to the authority of their leaders, the latter being, of course, chosen by the phalange, which provided cadres for the workers as it did for the rest of the population. The state promised that it would grant aid and protection and that it would act faithfully toward the workers. In return, it required unconditional loyalty and obedience. Finally, the phalange intervened in the country's life by means of social work, which it is more tempting to call charitable work, and which it alone organized. The essential achievement in this respect was Auxilio Social, founded in autumn 1936 by Mercedes Sanz Backhiller, the widow of the phalangist leader Onésimo Redondo, but which was in fact run by Pilar Primo de Rivera. Auxilio Social had begun as an organization for winter aid. Initially, it had provided 3 dining halls for orphans. Later, aid was extended to refugees. These were Brotherhood Kitchens, a name beloved by the regime. Later on, help was organized for sick and aged workers. The headquarters of Auxilio Social was in Valladolid. Its means were provided by the efforts of phalangist women and later on by the social service, the equivalent for women from 17 to 35 of what military service was for men. This also was to help establish an atmosphere of brotherhood. Married women, widows, and disabled women were exempt from it. In theory, it was voluntary, but a woman could not take an examination or get a job in the administration if she had not served in it. The distribution of this substantial aid required considerable financial means, and government contributions were quite inadequate. The necessary resources were supplied by fortnightly collections, the sale of Auxilio Social stamps, and in particular by blue forms, whose signers committed themselves to regular payments. As elsewhere, independently of the phalange, the nationalist government was particularly concerned with 2 problems arising from the war: help for the families of combatants, for whom a relief fund was set up and maintained by a 10% tax on luxury goods, and the colocation familiar de niños, typical of the kind of poverty created by the war. The task of this organization was to search every locality for families able to provide orphans or children separated from their parents by the war with the sacred warmth of a family. They also had to be able to give them a good education. Moreover, the official wording provided that they had to be models of behavior, religion, and morality, in order to give the rescued children a Christian education and the holy love of the fatherland. They were chosen with great care. A local junta, including the alcaide, the doyen of the priests, and a municipal health officer, appointed guardians and supplied detailed information about them supporting their applications. Moreover, it had to make sure that such guardians carried out their duties. In all such institutions, hand in hand with a charitable spirit went the desire for law and order and the wish to struggle for the triumph of official morality, which was both Christian morality and the phalange's political morality. In spite of declarations of social intent by the state, the fact was that the only achievements were exclusively charitable measures, making use of goodwill and private contributions. The Genefico Social Welfare Fund was kept going by profits made during the single course day, the result of public collections authorized by the state, and finally, but as a last resort, by contributions from the state. As to social justice, profit sharing, and the other promises in the labor charter, not one had even begun to be put into effect by 1939. The only serious attempt made had been the introduction of the Suicidio Familiar, a family grant made to the head of the family from a fund maintained by workers and measures preached by the phalange, but this aid for families was mainly the result of the considerable influence of the Catholic Church. The Church and the new state, perhaps the only thing that is certain in the present state of affairs, Storer said in 1938, is that, under the present regime, the influence of the Catholic Church has greatly increased in nationalist Spain. We have already pointed out that a large number of Spanish priests had approved and supported the rebellion from the outset. Cardinal Segura, whose differences with the Falange were later to take a most violent turn, he was even induced to quit Spanish soil for a while, had fought against the Popular Front. Cardinal Goma y Tomas tried to convince the French episcopate of the sanctity of the crusade. On August 15, 1936, Cardinal Illandain presided over an official ceremony alongside Queipo de Llano. Some lesser religious personalities adopted very violent attitudes in their speeches. Bahamonde quoted a sermon by a priest from Rota. "All this filth must be swept away. I am warning you, everyone, to Mass. I am not accepting any excuses." Georges Bernanos testified that compulsory attendance at Mass was backed, at least in the early months of the war, by serious threats. However, it must be pointed out that certain priests had had the courage to protest against mass executions, even at the risk of themselves becoming victims of Paisios. Bahamonde quoted the case of a priest from Carmona, killed for protesting against the Falange's crimes. The Church's influence, however, did not cease growing. One of the reasons that had prompted several monarchist leaders to rally to the new regime, among them Rodezno, later Minister of Justice, was quite clearly the government's alliance with the Vatican, accompanied by the abolition of the secular measures taken by the Republicans. It was thus that the legislation on divorce was suppressed, the March 2, 1938 decree authorizing only the investigation of requests concerning preventive moves against separations of husbands and wives. The measure that made the greatest impact in this respect was the May 3, 1938 decree authorizing the return of the Jesuits to Spain. This move was not presented as a move in favor of the Catholic Church, but as a reparation. In the government's view, two motives justified it. First, it was an eminently Spanish order, and it was natural, at a time when Hispanidad was being rediscovered, that the Jesuits should recover their rights and property. This was part of the return to tradition. The other reason was the enormous cultural contribution made to the country by the Jesuits. At a time when the influence of Marxist intellectuals had to be destroyed, the Jesuits would naturally help to make Spain a country united in its Catholicity. Their role was at any rate debated. Bahamonde saw them as the most violent instigators of repression. The Church was present everywhere in the new state, first of all in the army. Military chaplains were restored at the end of 1936, and a decree in May 1937 completed the organization of Catholic spiritual aid in war units. Under the guidance of the Cardinal Archbishop of Toledo, the pontifical delegate, the staff were recruited from mobilized priests. The Church and education, but it was in the field of education that the activities of the clergy had most effect, particularly after 1938, when Franco called in Sáenz Rodríguez as Minister of Education. Suier, though a fervent Catholic, said the new minister was the most Vatican-minded legislator that Spain has known. The secular teaching staff had on the whole been loyal to the Republic. On several occasions, Franco's government had had to close the secondary schools for lack of staff. Thus, in 1937, the national schools in Santander, Mérida, and Talavera had been temporarily closed. The premises were usually occupied afterward by the army. When there was staff available, it had to be very carefully integrated. Teachers who had been kept in their posts by the purge commissions were regarded as still in need of fresh control and training. Thus, special courses were organized during the summer for their benefit in all provincial capitals. In the first week, they attended conferences on religion, the fatherland, man, and master. During the second week, subjects treated were classified under such headings as pedagogy of religion, history of the fatherland, children, and school. The lecturers in charge of religious courses were appointed by the bishop. The titles of their lessons were significant. One was devoted to demonstrating the superiority of the Christian religion over Eastern-style religions. Another lesson dealt with the Catholic conception of the Master, according to Pope Pius XI's encyclical, concessions to modernity that permitted references to psychology and psychopathology did not rule out constant and basic intervention by the Church in teacher training. Religious instruction was made compulsory in primary as well as in secondary education. The only ones exempt were natives in the Protectorate of Morocco and the African colonies, whom it was advisable not to shock by clumsy proselytism. Elsewhere and for everyone else, Religious instruction ranged from a simple knowledge of the catechism and religious history in the early years to more complicated lessons in the form of broad-minded explanations of Catholic dogma. It ended in the 5th year of secondary education with some training in apologetic. Quite apart from these lessons, religion was ever present. Thus, there was exaggerated respect in the schools for rules of devotion to the Virgin Mary. A decree in April 1937 compelled masters to place a picture of the Virgin, preferably under the typically Spanish invocation of the Immaculate Conception, in their classrooms, in such a way that the pupils entering and leaving could see her while exchanging the ritual phrases with their master. Ave Maria Purissima, sin pecado concebida. Moreover, a special invocation was repeated each day throughout the war. Of course, this was, according to the legislators, a case of returning to the traditions of the spirit of the people. But, in reality, it was teaching with a well-defined orientation, intended to mold citizens who were at the same time practicing Christians. Starting with primary school, it was, according to the official instructions, necessary for every scholastic environment to be subjected to the influence of Catholic doctrine. Purely religious manifestations increased. An order in February 1938 established a holiday for the feast of St. Thomas Aquinas and organized a commemorative ceremony to perpetuate this model of saintliness in the minds of generations of pupils. All the academic authorities were present, and the students were represented by the SED. Similarly, it became obligatory for the Holy Crucifix to be placed in intermediate teaching colleges and universities. Everything had to testify to the radical change. Lay schools were those with a Soviet regime. National education had to be Christian, and the teaching of social brotherhood, as proclaimed by the Church, was to do away with odious materialism. This was an education in depth that did not end at the school gates. It was not enough for children to attend Mass in a group, led by their masters. The recommendations made to inspectors of primary education reminded them that school was an institution that helped to dignify the religious spirit, that it was educational and formed good patriots, and finally that in it young girls were to learn their lofty duties in family and home. In this way, the forms of religious, civic, and patriotic education were closely linked. To maintain this atmosphere, the use of popular songs and patriotic anthems and biographies was recommended, as well as the reading of newspapers and commentaries on news items, which was evidently an original conception of the study of history. And since this education was meant for everyone, adults too would learn what the national movement was in their own classes. The aim of all this was to spread the idea that life is combat, sacrifice, discipline, struggle, and austerity. But the discipline promised to everyone had to be imposed on everyone. Nationalist society was Christian and hierarchical. The oath of loyalty, sworn according to various formulae, was evidence of it. Thus, magistrates taking office stood and swore the oath before the Holy Crucifix. To the formula, "Do you swear before God and the Holy Gospels to give unconditional support to the Caudillo of Spain, to render honest and impartial justice, to obey the laws and provisions pertaining to the exercise of your office, without other motive than the faithful accomplishment of your duty and the good of Spain?" The judge replied with the sacred formula. The formula for academic oaths was even more original and symbolic. Before a desk on which were placed a copy of the Gospels in the Vulgate, the cover decorated with the sign of the cross, and a copy of Don Quixote, the cover decorated with the phalange arms, the academician had to swear before God and his guardian angel to serve Spain continually and loyally, under the authority and rule of its living tradition, its Catholicity as embodied by the Roman Pontiff, and its continuity as represented by the Caudillo. Hispanidad. The foundation of the Spanish Institute served a twofold aim: to conserve national wealth and to preserve and propagate tradition. Although its president was the great musician Manuel de Falla, the list of presidents of learned societies was revelatory of a state of mind, because it contained the most eminent representatives of conservative opinion: Pamartin, the Duke of Alba, the Count of Romanones, and Goicoechea. With the foundation of the Institute, the protection bestowed on the arts was to restore Spain's prestige in such a way that she would rapidly recover the leadership of all Spanish-speaking nations. Hispanidad was to be achieved by union between Spain and the Latin American states. Students in the SED were advised to make every effort to establish links with those in Latin America. Thus the imperial vocation, a favorite theme of the Phalangists, was on the way to being achieved. It was in this spirit that the Order of Alfonso X, the Wise, designed to reward Spaniards who have distinguished themselves in the sciences, education, literature, or the arts, and the Imperial Order of the Red Arrows, which, in a vague way, was to reward national merit, were founded. Naturally, such a policy contained dangers, especially that of displeasing allies. Some young Phalangists had vociferously demonstrated their wish to rebuild a great Iberian power, which could not fail to antagonize Portugal. But the nationalist government took care to modify such intemperance. It was therefore more out of an intellectual game than out of living reality that Franco's Spain projected herself as the successor to the Spain of the Catholic kings, of Charles V and Philip II. It was advisable to convince all Spaniards that, if they accepted the trials and tribulations of the war, it was in order to achieve a great ideal, so that Spain could re-echo the royal motto, "One great J free." In the meantime, lacking real power, the nationalists had to make do with affirmations of principle and symbolic gestures, such as re-establishing the Order of Isabella the Catholic, of which the head of state became Grand Master. Such decorations, and the ceremonies that commemorated the glorious anniversaries of Calvo Sotelo's death and the July 18th uprising, were primarily intended to preserve the nationalist army's determination to fight. The nationalist army, the spirit of sacrifice, and the military qualities of the nationalist troops were indisputable. There were occasions when Italian or German allies questioned the decisions of the Spanish command or the unpreparedness of the troops in action. They never complained of lack of courage. This was necessary in a war that grew in bitterness. According to General Walsh, in 1938, the average life expectancy of a lieutenant from the military academy was 43 days. However, the cadres maintained their level of ability because a special effort had been made in this field. Since the end of 1936, recruitment, organization, and training of troops had been entrusted to General Orgaz. His first concern had been to establish schools and courses for officer training. Military academies increased. There were 3 for infantry, 1 for cavalry, 1 for supply, and 1 for engineers. Specialists were harder to recruit, and in January 1937, radio operators were mobilized. Then an air school was created. Flight and ground staff bonuses were freely distributed. There was never any general mobilization. Young men in civilian clothes were still to be seen in nationalist Spain. It is certain that the government had hesitated at the beginning before calling up a mass of politically undecided and, in certain regions, even hostile men. The superiority of the regular army then seemed adequate enough for the recourse to mobilization to be avoided. At the time of the big battle at Madrid, the nationalist army consisted of barely more than 250,000 men, a large part of which was made up of the Spanish Foreign Legion and Moorish troops. There were still many recruits from Morocco, helped by General Franco's clever treatment of natives. The Caudillo had always been at pains to distinguish between the laws applying to the homeland and the ones that had been created for the Rif areas. Although he had made certain special disciplinary provisions for the Moorish troops, such as a ban on frequenting taverns, he had also adopted special measures for financial aid to the wounded and their families. A veteran of the Rif War, he had been adept at winning over troops and had chosen his honor guard there. He never lost sight of the need for substantial military recruitment in Morocco and was constantly humoring the Moroccan nationalists in spite of noisy affirmations of principle about the nation and the empire. However, after 1937, the army was strengthened. The formation of a Red Army capable of fighting forced the nationalists to levy fresh troops. At the time of the Battle of Teruel, the nationalist army comprised 600,000 men. After the end of 1937, it merged regular troops and militias into a single force. 66 banderas from the Phalange, 31 tercios from the Requetes, and 36 battalions from various political organizations were brought into the new single-party militias. The new head of the militias, Colonel Monasterio, one of the leaders of the Army of the South, had played an important part in the early fighting. In this way, not only had the political parties disappeared, but also their chances of one day being revived as combat forces. The party, the church, the army. These were the 3 forces in the New Spain, the pillars of the national syndicalist state. It was a totalitarian state, which crushed opposition, possessed a remarkable police apparatus, and imposed obedience through a powerful state bureaucracy. But it was not a fascist power. It had retained only the forms, the cadres, and the appeal to nationalism of fascism, a simple means of channeling minds toward dreams of greatness and conquest, because Spain, poor before the war and ruined after it, could only dream of greatness without any hope of attaining it. There was no question of any social achievements here, such as existed in Italy and especially in Germany. The workers' and peasants' living conditions were as bad as ever. The indispensable agrarian reforms had not even been contemplated. This was because in reality, behind the dictatorship of the church and the army, and behind Franco's dictatorship, lay the domination of a class, or more precisely of a social caste. Franco's Spain was the Spain of the big landowners, of the old aristocracy, the Spain of the oligarchs. The army and the party were merely instruments of their authority, and they exercised their power all the more rigorously in that they had been afraid of losing it when the revolution had roused the popular masses, and in that they had to fight long and hard to carry the day. At the end of 1937, in spite of their successes, they were not yet certain of victory. Chapter 19. Teruel. Turning point of the war. We have seen that, during the course of 1937, there was a parallel political evolution in the two camps. In both Valencia and Burgos, the forces of strength prevailed over the elements tending toward dispersion, the official authority over the supporters of the movement. The evolution thus set in motion seemed irreversible. It was impossible to envisage a violent political reversal in nationalist Spain after the Camisas Verdes were brought to heel, any more than in Republican Spain after the May Days. Thus there was a return to the conditions of a war in the traditional mold. However, an examination of events on the military level reveals an evolution unfavorable to the Valencia government. Conditions for the offensive. It is indisputable that the military situation at the end of 1937 gave the Republicans great cause for concern. The chief feeling after the fall of the North was one of total impotence. Every attempt to restrict the scope of the nationalist successes had failed in the end. There had certainly been an attempt at reorganization. Rojo listed 5 army corps, trained and on a war footing. But their equipment was still inadequate and, more important, they lacked faith in their means. Moreover, the end of the fighting in Asturias released a large number of well-trained nationalist troops. These reinforcements made a profound change in the balance of forces on the part of the front where they were deployed. In fact, Franco now had almost 600,000 men, about a third of whom could be held in reserve. The Navarrese forces, which alone had preserved their original organization in brigades, had been reorganized into divisions after November 9th. Of the 3 sectors from which the nationalists could choose to launch a new offensive, 2 were held by forces relatively weak in number, the one in the south still under Queipo, and the one in the north under Davila. The heaviest concentration of troops was around Madrid. It therefore seemed to the Nationalist General Staff that, in order to achieve a conclusive victory, it had to be won in this sector, by far the most important. For the first time since Guadalajara, Franco felt ready to strike hard in the direction of the capital. There was, however, no question of a frontal offensive, which would risk coming to grief at the hands of a well-organized defense, and would at any rate cause heavy casualties. It was therefore better to revert to the principle of a flank attack. The offensive had to be on as broad a scale as possible to make maximum use of the numerical and material superiority of the nationalists. Opinion favored a pincer movement on Alcalá de Henares. The Moroccan Army Corps was, according to Diaz de Villegas, to move down the Henares, the CTV to advance along the Tajuna, and the Castilian Army Corps along the Tagus. This vast maneuver naturally called for fairly lengthy preparation. Moreover, such a substantial concentration of troops could hardly fail to pass unnoticed. Meanwhile, the Republican General Staff was aware that, if it once again let the nationalists take the initiative in operations, it stood in danger of defeat. The Republican government was in dire need of a success to boost the morale of its supporters and to justify its actions by a demonstration of effectiveness. By the end of 1937, Negrin was in a position of political strength. His friends had taken over the UGT leadership. He transferred ministries and central administrative offices from Valencia to Barcelona. The premier explained this transfer, inconceivable at the beginning of the year. It is an old idea of the previous governments. The government's residence in Valencia had been determined by the need to organize supplies and military operations for the central and eastern fronts. The government is convinced that the Levant area will retain its enthusiasm. Economic and strategic considerations have demanded that the government have its seat in Barcelona ever since the movimiento began. The motives advanced were not new ones. The transfer had not been made any earlier because the strength of the CNT and of the autonomous had made the installation of the government in Barcelona difficult. Now, Negrin could refer in his speech to cordial relations with the Generalidad. In this sense, it was possible to talk of a strengthening of unity in the Republican camp. However, political unity could only really be forged by a military victory. The Battle of Teruel, the Republican General Staff was therefore forced onto the offensive. On December 8, the Supreme War Council approved the choice of Teruel as an objective. The positions seemed to favor an attack. The front was shaped like a big loop that came to a point around the town, forming a salient in the Republican lines. To the north it followed the mountainous area overlooking the Alfambra, bending sharply and moving southeast-northwest between Teruel and Albarracin, north of the Montes Universals. The government troops therefore held positions dominating the town on two sides. Moreover, against the modest forces that the nationalists had there, as they had along the whole of the northern front 2,500 men to defend Teruel at the start of the battle, the Republicans committed substantial forces, 40,000 men in a very limited sector of the attack. The three army corps that made up the striking force were supported by troops from the Levant that had been holding the sector until then. The 22nd Army Corps under Ibarola was to attack in the north, the 20th under Menendez in the southeast, and the 18th under Heredia in the south. The first aim of the maneuver was to effect a link beyond Teruel between the troops of the 18th and the 22nd Army Corps, thus isolating the town's defenders and simultaneously reducing the salient. The offensive began on December 15th. For a week, from the 15th to the 22nd, it achieved considerable success. From the start, it was clear that the enveloping movement was working. Campillo, which had resisted, and San Bias fell. Even so, there were substantial pockets of resistance in the rear which had to be wiped out one by one. On the 18th, the Muela de Teruel, which dominated the town to the southwest, fell. Its defenders, fighting as they retreated, had taken refuge in the town, which two Republican divisions entered on the 22nd. The Nationalists, under Colonel Ray Darcourt, had entrenched themselves in the civil government buildings, the Bank of Spain, the seminary, and the convents of Santa Clara and Santa Teresa. Two fronts were thus organized. An external front, more or less regular, to the west of a line from Muleton to San Bias and Rubiales, and another within the city, in order to reduce the several thousand men who had taken refuge there. The Republican forces were not sufficiently numerous both to carry out the conquest of the town and to pursue an attack in depth, and there was a period of stability from 23 to December 28. During this time, the Nationalists brought up reinforcements which enabled them to hold on and even to counterattack. Evidently, they had had to choose between defending Teruel and mounting an attack on Madrid. Franco had personally decided to join battle on the enemy's ground. He had begun by sending troops withdrawn from the Aragon front, from which they could come quickly, to the aid of the threatened sector. They had been there since December 17th. Then he launched the divisions from the Army Corps of Galicia, commanded by Aranda, along the Saragossa road, and the Army Corps of Castile under Varela, along the road to Molina in Aragon toward the front line. The Nationalist General Staff now had 10 divisions at its disposal. Davila was given command of them, together with the mission of rescuing Teruel. The influx of troops in itself was already a success for the Republicans. More fortunate than at Bunit, they had forced the Nationalists to alter their plans and to give up their large-scale offensive against Madrid, of which moreover there was no further question until the end of the war. There was great disappointment among Franco's allies, as witnessed by this note from Schwendemann. Hopes before the events at Teruel of seeing Franco end the war with an offensive in the grand style were ill-founded. On December 20th, Count Chano was telling himself that the offensive against Guadalajara has been indefinitely postponed because of the Nationalist command's hesitancy and the preventive offensive by the Reds. The failure of the Nationalist counteroffensive justified the fears of the Italian generals. In spite of the accumulation of material, air superiority, the vast concentration of artillery, and, finally, the violence of the attacks, only part of the objectives had been attained. At first, there were a few successes. The Republican 20th Army Corps retreated in disorder. Aranda's troops advanced toward Teruel and recaptured La Muela. They dominated the town and were so certain of taking it that the nationalist radio announced it as a fait accompli. Yet at the beginning of January a new front line had emerged. It barely altered for a month. How can this nationalist failure be explained? First, by the scope and bitterness of the fighting. In order to hold the line, fresh troops and material were brought up on both sides. The figure of 180,000 soldiers that has been advanced may be taken as a likely one. It was the largest concentration of men in so confined a space throughout the entire war. But the battle was also one of material. The amount of artillery involved was so great that the infantry had to dig in, and reinforcements came up only at night. Fighting conditions had become remarkably difficult, the more so because in this part of the interior where the climate was harsh, the cold had reappeared with an intensity all its own. Soldiers had to be relieved every quarter of an hour, and at -4 degrees, entrenched men first had to protect themselves from cold, snow, and wind. Framed against the snow, everything became a target, and attacks grew rarer. Even night convoys found it difficult to arrive in the frost. The trenches are strewn with iron carcasses. The nationalists' air superiority could not be fully exploited, because the weather did not always permit sorties. Ansaldo referred to mornings at the new Burgos airport, when you had to remove a thick layer of ice from the fuselage. Moreover, the Republicans had made considerable efforts too, and the narrowness of the front contributed to an effective use of anti-aircraft defenses in spite of these difficult conditions. The nationalists kept up their attacks during the first week of January. Finally, on January 7th, calm was restored. The pursuit of the offensive no longer had any meaning, because the defenders of the town had surrendered. Teruel was completely in the hands of the Republicans. The struggle had been long and harsh. One after another, the buildings in which the nationalists were sheltering had been destroyed. The seminary had been fired, and government troops had blown up the Bank of Spain. Hopes of making Teruel another Alcazar were in vain. The defenders were cut off from each other, and the convent of Santa Clara surrendered only on the 8th 24 hours after Rey d'Arcourt had capitulated with 1,500 men. An official communiqué announced, "The whole of Teruel belongs to the Republic." This was not, however, a remarkable success. The center of the town was in ruins, and it took a fortnight to eliminate all the snipers. This was because the defense had been courageous, in spite of what Queipo had asserted on Radio Seville about the betrayal by scum that alone had caused the fall of the town. But this very anger clearly indicated the importance of the capture of Teruel to the Republicans. It was the first and only important town that they had managed to recapture during the war. Although it was incorrect to state, as Rojo did, that Teruel changed the face of the war, at least it can be conceded that it gave the impression of having done so. With the outcome of this terrible battle, it was the Republican army that appeared the victor. After the depressing communiques that had announced in turn the loss of Bilbao, Santander, and Gijón, here at last was a hopeful one. But this victory was limited. The question had been raised, as with all the Republican successes, as to whether it would have been possible to exploit the initial success better. The answer was in the negative. There was a lack of reserves. All in all, the Republicans were numerically weaker than their opponents, when in order to make up for their inferiority in arms and equipment they needed at least a numerical superiority in men. They succeeded in this only for a few days, long enough for the enemy to bring up reinforcements. In such circumstances, it was a real triumph for the Republican General Staff to have been able to hold on to the positions gained. But this was also why Franco could not pause at a defeat that he had good reason to believe was only temporary. In fact, the Republican leaders ought not to have forgotten, in the euphoria of success, that even there they had at one point been on the brink of disaster. On the 29th, their lines had been breached. That day, in Teruel, as earlier at Bernit, there had been a moment of panic for which no one could give a reasonable explanation. It had been necessary to rush up reinforcements to restore the front line and to prevent Aranda's troops from linking up with the ones under siege in the town. The nationalist counteroffensive after January 15th, the weather grew milder, and the nationalists were once again able to show their air superiority. Aranda was mounting an attack not against Teruel, because an advance across the plain presented too many dangers, but against the positions that dominated it, especially to the north. His men thus managed to seize some important observation posts, including the one at Muleton, which endangered the positions of the Republican forces. Thus they had a launching base for operations which now shifted to the north around the Alfambra River. But it was first necessary to break up fresh Republican attacks, which lasted 5 days, from 25 to January 30th, and produced no results. It was then necessary to concentrate the forces designed to pierce the Republican front to the west of the Alfambra, and to dislodge the troops who were holding strong positions in the Sierra Palomera. This was where the victorious December offensive opened. But the Nationalist command was even more ambitious. Its plan consisted of pushing back the front toward the east, in such a way as to outflank Teruel and the Republican positions to the north. Eventually, during the course of operations, it envisaged a pincer movement by the 23rd Army Corps, which was covering this sector. The attack was therefore directed against the two far ends of the Nationalist positions. To the north, under Yeague, the Moroccan Army Corps, supported by the Navarrese, was to advance in the direction of Viver del Rio. To the south, the Army Corps of Galicia, reinforced by Muñoz Grandez's 150th Division, was to breach the front in the mountainous area between Teruel and Salados and to cross the Alfambra. The center of the line was weakest. It was manned by Colonel Monasterio's 1st Division. The two-pronged attack opened on February 5th and managed to win an initial success. Yagali's troops had broken through the front and had managed to outflank the Republican positions as far as the Alhambra. To the south, however, Aranda's advance was slower. Apparently the river had been reached and Salados occupied. But the immediate danger to Teruel to a stiffening of the Republican defense more bad weather once again slowed down the fighting, and the offensive came to a halt about February 15th, hindered by wind and rain. The pincer movement had not succeeded, but the Nationalists had on the whole improved their positions. From then on, the front consisted of an almost continuous line between Teruel and Belchite to the south of the Ebro. The Republicans had been sorely tried by the battle of attrition that they had been enduring for almost 2 months, and when the Nationalists took to the offensive again, on the 18th, their defensive position was at once breached. Teruel was virtually outflanked by the forward troops, who cut the Sagunto road to the east on the 20th. For another 2 days there was fighting in Teruel, but it was only half-hearted. On February 22nd, the Republicans evacuated the town completely. The battle was over. Just as the occupation of Teruel had at one point contributed to restoring the faith of the Republican troops, its loss could be regarded as a very serious turning point in the course of the Civil War. Both sides began furiously disputing the ruins. The successful raid became a protracted battle, a battle of destruction in which material superiority ultimately prevailed. Teruel was perhaps, as Rojo put it, the revelation of the moral grandeur of the Spanish soldier. But the bravery and persistence of the men were not in themselves enough to bring about victory. Teruel had proved that, too. The end of the battle, in fact, marked the beginning of a new phase in the war. Until then, there had been a certain balance from the military point of view. In Teruel, masses of men had faced each other for months without managing to win a decisive success. Suddenly, the Republican lines gave way, and the Nationalist offensive spread irresistibly. The balance of forces had been conclusively destroyed. The Battle of Aragon. Meanwhile, in Republican Spain, the authority of the Negrin government seemed to have strengthened progressively since July 1937. The CNT had given up all idea of serious opposition. The UGT leadership was solidly behind Negrin. But the government's political program, based on the imperative of defeat Franco first, made it absolutely necessary for him to win military victories. The loss of the North, which followed closely on the heels of his accession to power, and which he was unable either to prevent or to delay, dealt a harsh blow to his prestige. The Aragon disaster affected it even more. From then on, military and civil crises developed side by side, both of them weakening Republican Spain. Of course, it must be allowed that the Negrin government had barely had time, before the first fighting of any scope, to take over the organization of the war. Yet a huge effort had been made in the military field in 1937. The reorganization, undertaken at the beginning of the year, had made it possible to train and equip troops who had given proof of their fighting ability at Teruel and Belchite. But there had always been a lack of reserves, and the best troops, barely trained, had been used at once. The offensives at Brunete and Belchite had been costly in human lives. The battle of attrition at Teruel had tired and tested the men, obliged to fight too many days on end without being relieved. Finally, the slowing down of deliveries of foreign war material put a heavy strain on the troops' equipment. Republican Spain was suffering from the blockade, broken only in September 1937. From the end of the year, in spite of the steps taken by the Western powers, ships had to run heavy risks to enter government ports. The only route left open was the Pyrenean frontier, which explains the government's constant anxiety not to be cut off from France. This was one of the arguments put forward by Negrin to explain the transfer of the government to Barcelona. It was this too that persuaded the Republican ministers to remain in the Catalan capital when the Republican territory was split in half by the nationalist offensive. But Catalonia was only defended by a small proportion of the Republican forces. The Battle of Teruel had forced the nationalists to mass the majority of their troops on both sides of the town and, further north, from the Mestrago to the Ebro. Although the Catalos' plans had been upset and there was no longer any question of launching a major offensive against Madrid in order to decide the issue, the concentration of troops on the Aragon front after the victory at Teruel put an undeniably superior striking force at the Nationalist command's disposal. 3 Army Corps against 1, the 12th Republican Army Corps. With the Aragon offensive in particular, the war changed in character. The war of static positions was over. The breakthrough was followed at once by a general offensive. And in this new mobile war, motorized troops and armor, advancing in mass formations, played a decisive role. The attack had opened on March 9, 1938. The terrain, mostly open ground, was that on which the Battle of Belchite had been fought, a region suitable for a large-scale offensive because there were no obstacles over a large radius, and because it lent itself admirably to the use of tanks and sweeping movements. Franco had concentrated huge numbers of troops there. The Galician Army Corps, to the south, was to attack in the direction of Montalban, and the Corpo Truppe Voluntary in the Llanos area toward Icaias. The Moroccan Army Corps, to the north, operating from Belchite, had as its objective the right bank of the Ebro, toward Caspe. The aim of the offensive led by Aranda was to pierce the front held by the 12th Republican Army Corps and to reach the Guadalupe on the Caspe-Alcaias line. In this way, a huge pocket would be formed in the Republican front, driving the army of the east north of the Ebro, and threatening to outflank the forces concentrated around Teruel to their right. The occupation of the positions aimed at to the south and southwest of Montalban would also enable the nationalists to control the approaches to the non-mountainous region of the Mestrago. Beyond the Caspe-Alcaias line, the nationalist general staff was in fact aiming for the Mediterranean and was trying to cut Republican Spain in half. The nationalist attack was not, strictly speaking, a surprise, but it caught the Republican forces in the middle of reorganization. The 18th Army Corps, which was in reserve, could not even intervene. For the first time since the beginning of the war, there was an actual collapse of the front, quite unlike the local panics that had been a feature of such operations. The Italian and Moroccan motorized columns advanced without meeting practically any resistance. The best organized Republican troops fell back to the north of the Ebro. The rest were little more than a mass of leaderless fugitives. Ill-equipped and ill-armed, they could not hold out in the face of such a large-scale operation. The 21st Army Corps, which had at first contained the Galicians, had to fall back because of the threat north of its positions. From then on, a vast area lay open and defenseless to the enemy's advance. On March 15th, Rojo wrote, "In the vast area stretching from Caspe to Calanda, there was only one organized unit left. There was no longer any link between the Army of the East and the Tactical Reserve, and a 30-mile front lay completely exposed to the invasion as far as the coast. In 6 days, the CTV covered half the distance that separated it from the Mediterranean. It is difficult, in such circumstances, to understand why this lightning offensive, which slowed down between the 15th and the 21st of March, was called off. Only the official communiques and Chano's optimism can explain the halt on the positions gained by the need to let the nationalist troops support the Italians. In fact, the nationalists had been the first to be surprised by the scale of their success. The troops, Chano noted on March 14th, are advancing with unexpected rapidity. But after 5 days of lightning progress, the pace of the motorized columns had to be cut down. Reserves were inadequate to exploit the initial successes immediately, and it was necessary to wait for the Navarrese before setting off again. The Republican General Staff took advantage of this to regroup a few units which it used on suicide missions for harassing and delaying actions. On March 20th, it managed to re-establish an undeniably weak but continuous front. In the brief respite that the nationalist pause gave them, the government forces saw fit to bring up as many reinforcements as possible to plug the gap and, more important, to defend Catalonia. In fact, Prieto told the cabinet, "If the rebels reach the Mediterranean, 4/5 of the army will be in the southern zone." Between March 15th and April 15th, the date on which the nationalists reached the sea at Vinaròs, the Barcelona General Staff tried to slip through as many troops as possible along the Tortosa Coast Road. This explains the bitterness of the Republican resistance, first on the Caspalcafies line and then, after it was breached, at Tortosa. But in the end, this resistance had only been and could only be sporadic. In fact, the first nationalist offensive had achieved far-reaching consequences. The disorganization that it had caused could not have been put right in a few days. Moreover, the resumption of the offensive would not have permitted it. Confusion among the Republicans was so great that the exact positions of the nationalists were not known. 2 officers from the international brigades were captured in Gandesa, not realizing that it had fallen. The remnants of various units made their way to the right bank of the Ebro, where they were joined by reinforcements from the central zone. Perhaps for the first time, in the face of such a large-scale debacle, there were some who envisioned the approaching end of the conflict. Staff officers had to go up into the front line to try to take a grip on their troops and to improvise a defense as best they could. Generalization of the offensive, but above all else, it was the generalization of the offensive that gave the Aragon defeat its disastrous character. After the attack on Caspe, 6 Nationalist Army Corps were in action. In the north, the idea was to prevent the 10th and 11th Republican Army Corps, spread out from the Ebro to the Pyrenees, from coming to the help of the scattered and defeated forces to the south of the river. The nationalist success was clinched through a surprise attack by the Moroccan Army Corps, which suddenly crossed the river along which it had until then been deployed. The 10th and 11th Republican Army Corps met a fate similar to that of the 12th a few days earlier, though on terrain less favorable to a combined attack. There, too, resistance was practically non-existent. The only serious opposition in 10 days was that met by the nationalists at Lerida, which fell on April 3rd. The front was stabilized in this sector. But in the meantime, the offensive had spread to both sides of the river, with the Aragon and Moroccan Army Corps and Urgel's recently formed Army Corps. The Republicans could only re-establish themselves on a line from the Ebro to the Pyrenees, along the Segre and the Noguera, natural defenses behind which the remains of the 2 defeated Army Corps could withdraw. Rojo made special mention of Colonel Beltran's 43rd Division, which, isolated after the breach of the front, fought a 3-month delaying action by hugging the Pyrenean foothills before being interned in France, where it passed with the greater part of its equipment. But isolated resistance of this kind could only slow down the nationalist advance, not halt it, the more so because Franco had decided to strike in the south and join battle in the Levant, where the 3 Army Corps were reaching the Mediterranean. At the nationalist headquarters, there was talk about whether it was desirable to make a fresh effort in Catalonia, which was held by sorely tried troops, or whether it was necessary to try to crush the enemy by attacking the Republican striking force, whose lines were dangerously stretched. The second solution was the one chosen. It was in practice the more difficult operation. The mountainous area from the Mestrago to the sea, the slopes of the Sierra de Javalamber, which rose to as much as 5,000 to 6,000 feet above sea level, and, to a lesser degree, of the Sierra de Espadon between Castellón and Valencia, were uniquely easy to defend. Moreover, the government forces were fortifying a line from Viver to Segorbe. Their troops there were fresher. Against them, far more men and material had to be concentrated in a much more restricted area during the early part of the offensive. While the Moroccan Army Corps was covering the sector from the Ebro to the Delta, the Navarrese and Galicians under Aranda switched back to the south and advanced along the coast, occupying Castellón without difficulty. At the same time, Varela was drawing up the Castilian Army Corps and the CTV, whose motorized units were once again to play a decisive role. This meant a new breakthrough. The forces concentrated by the Republicans to save Valencia were the last available to Miaja, appointed commander of the Central Southern Zone. There were no reserves left. The sole reinforcements, necessary as they were, could only have been procured from the Army of the Center, which would have meant dangerously stripping Madrid of its defenses for the first time. Franco was counting on the imminent fall of Valencia, the third largest city in Spain until recently the seat of government, a moral success at least as important as the conquest of the Levant. The latter would deprive the Central Southern Zone, where the food situation was always uncertain, of an area indispensable to its supplies. But the difficulties of the operation required 2 months of preparation. The Battle of the Levant was not joined until the summer. On July 15th, it was launched with enormous material support on both sides of Teruel. On the 13th and the 17th, Republican Army Corps had to withdraw. The armies of Varela and Aranda linked up and reached the Viver Segorbe line. From the 20th to the 23rd, after intense artillery preparation, there followed attacks by tanks and infantry on the fortified line. But in the end, the offensive failed. Between May and July, aware of the danger courted by the southern zone, the Republican General Staff regrouped its forces and launched a counterattack from the Ebro that forced the Nationalist General Staff to relax its grip on the Levant. Valencia was temporarily saved. However, since July 1938, the Republicans' military situation had taken a considerable turn for the worse. Aragon was lost, and the defense of the Maestrazgo remained uncertain. The Nationalists' material superiority was definitely proven, and their command's ability to fight the war with the modern means at its disposal. Finally, the division of Republican Spain into 2 zones was very serious, not only because it made an overall strategy difficult, but because it undermined the very basis of the political regime imposed by the Negrin government, obliged to delegate its powers to military authorities over a substantial part of its territory. Separated, the 2 zones developed differently in the political field, and the Central Southern Zone was soon without direct influence from the government. Meanwhile, the Aragon disaster had had a direct political consequence: a crisis in the very heart of the government. The dismissal of Prieto, the departure of Prieto from the Ministry of National Defense, was in fact the most important event that had occurred in Republican Spain since the fall of Largo Caballero. It intruded a note of discord into the atmosphere of relative political calm and holy union that had followed the events of spring 1937. Its importance derived first of all from the minister's personality. Prieto was well known abroad and was regarded by many as England's friend. He was a socialist who enjoyed the trust of the Republicans and even a certain respect in nationalist Spain, where historians went so far as to regard him as the only politician of worth in the Red Zone. He had long been regarded as the strong man of the Negrin government. The old friendship that bound him to the premier, whose candidacy he had supported after the crisis, was common knowledge. It was even thought that he would govern under Negrin's name. In fact, Negrin had taken his task seriously, deciding all the essential questions himself and not shirking any responsibility. Very soon, the 2 men experienced differences of opinion. They did not have the same conception of how the war should be handled, nor, more important, the same outlook, the same hopes for a happy outcome to the conflict. Their post-war disputes also betrayed a lively personal hostility. Though it was not yet March 1938, their relations had nevertheless worsened enough for Prieto to be removed from the key post he had held ever since the formation of the Government of Victory. Negrin's theory was that, faced with the seriousness of the military situation after the fall of Teruel and the Aragon disaster, he should have strengthened the executive in order to strengthen the wish and the determination to fight on. In his view, Prieto's pessimism did not make him a fit person to carry out the functions of Minister of National Defense in these circumstances. How could he entrust the control of the war to a man who did not believe in victory? In fact, it was to strengthen the executive that Negrin did not turn the Ministry of National Defense over to someone else but took charge of it himself, thus adding it to the premiership. Although Negrin claimed that in March there was a conflict within the government and that this conflict was due to Prieto's pessimism, the latter merely observed that his feelings had not altered and that they were known to everyone, especially Negrin, who had not, however, hesitated to appoint him Minister of National Defense the previous year. In fact, when Prieto left the ministry in March 1938, it was not his views on the prospects of a military victory but the military situation in Republican Spain that had changed. The loss of the North and the Aragon disaster led to political options that revolved around the dilemma of whether to resist or to negotiate. But Prieto claimed that this was not the motive behind his dismissal. In fact, in his view, responsibility for the crisis lay on the communists. It was they who had asked for his departure. Their determination to remove him was the one and only cause of it. According to him, there was only one conflict, the one that pitted him against the Communist Party. The communist ministers Uribe and Hernandez had tried to associate him with the leadership of a socialist communist splinter group in the government, and his denial had made them determined to fight him. It was indisputably the public attacks by La Pasionaria, followed by the articles by Hernandez in La Vanguardia and Frente Rojo signed Juan Ventura, that provoked the crisis, Prieto's protest to Negrin against this breach of ministerial solidarity, and then the reshuffle and the exclusion of Prieto. But, as Prieto vigorously repeated, he did not resign, he was dismissed. It is still not known whether, as he claimed, the decision to dismiss him was imposed on the premier by the Communist Party. There can be no doubt that the Communist Party leaders had used all their influence, which was in fact great, to work for his removal. He had long been one of their most valuable allies. In the struggle against Largo Caballero and over long months in the Negrin government, they had stood by him because he was a man of order whose views coincided with theirs, because he was the only politician capable of winning the active sympathy of the Western powers, and finally because he was a resolute supporter of socialist-communist unity. Now it turned out that this ally refused to become a tool. He rejected the alliance that was offered him in the government. As Minister of National Defense, he was infuriated by the Russian technicians' interference and did not hesitate to make direct attacks on the Communist Party and its influence in certain sectors, deliberately advertising his intention to make it bend to that iron discipline he had so often imposed. Prieto did not deny this. On the contrary, he recited at great length the tale of all the clashes that had brought him out against the communists and the Russian advisors. However, he kept quiet about the reasons behind a change of course that he could hardly admit, in that he would have been obliged at the same time to recognize his long alliance with the Communist Party. Prieto's motives were clear. They were bound up with the evolution of political and military events since the establishment of the government he had sponsored. In his view, communist support had been indispensable for the restoration of the state, just as Largo Caballeros had been at the outset. The state restored, the communist hold over the army and the police struck him as dangerous in many respects. In the domestic field, Prieto had witnessed the defection of many of his disciples. After the breakaway of the left wing, which followed Álvarez del Valle, an important section of the right wing, drawn by him into the anti-fascist coalition, seemed to follow Negrin in identifying itself on every point with the communist ally whose power constituted, as we have seen, a state within a state. In the foreign field, he was apparently very disillusioned by the attitude of the communists and the counsels of prudence from the Russians after the shelling of Almería. Undoubtedly, he lost some of his illusions on that occasion, when he had recognized the limitations of Russian aid. Thus, from then on, he lent more and more attention and importance to the attitudes of London and Paris, which were clearly not based on the same grounds as Moscow's. Certainly Prieto was not as much a friend of England as was claimed, but he was undeniably in favor of a negotiated peace for which England could have acted as agent. In May 1937, he tried to get in touch with the nationalists to study the possibilities of negotiation. A few months later, taking advantage of the exchange of prisoners that released Fernández Cuesta to rejoin Franco, he had several meetings with the Falangist leader on this subject. When the former prisoner became a minister in Burgos, he tried to renew contact with him, but the strong position of the communists in the Republican state was an obstacle to negotiations, whether they involved Franco or London. After the Aragon disaster, Negrin's chief concern was to stiffen resistance. Prieto no longer had faith in anything besides negotiation. It is probable that Negrin did not have to yield to pressure from the communists. The logic of his policy compelled the departure of Prieto, who was now both his and the Communist Party's enemy. Would an increase in the number of seats in the government through the return of union representatives have led, as Negrin's friends claimed, to the strengthening of his authority, in spite of Prieto's departure? It is open to doubt, because Prieto left at the very moment that the nationalists reached the Mediterranean and cut the Republic's territory in half. Negrin had to telephone General Miaja in order to assign him the responsibility of political and military power in the central southern zone. The political coalition in power relied more and more on agreement and collaboration with the army leaders, who were soon to revolt against it. For the time being, in spite of the Aragon disaster, Negrin had opted for resistance. Alvarez del Valle, his right-hand man, stated, "Thanks to the energy and presence of mind shown by the premier during these anxious days, the consequences of the disaster were considerably reduced." And he added this homage to the man whose faithful lieutenant he was. Dr. Negrin cannot be denied the merit of having saved the situation in 1938 and of having made the continuation of the war for another year possible. In effect, Negrin and Del Valle thought, in April 1938, that the mere fact of holding on still gave the Republic a chance of winning. Both believed that a European war was around the corner and that it could save Spain. On one condition, however, that the Republic had not been completely abandoned beforehand. Chapter 20. The abandonment of the Republic. In spite of a considerable delay, the application of the non-intervention agreement on April 19 gave the Western governments great hope. For the first time, it seemed that effective cooperation was shortly to come into being and bring about a solution to the problem raised by the internationalization of the war. For the first time, there was to be control, which would at least localize the conflict. Naturally, if it had been possible to obtain a faithful application of control by all concerned, the difficulties inherent in all international cooperation could have finally been overcome. But from the earliest days, the ill will of the Axis powers was made abundantly clear. In fact, after dragging out the talks, they only accepted control in the hopes of seeing the war brought to a rapid conclusion. After Guadalajara, the protraction of the war threatened the whole of the system painfully worked out by the non-intervention committee. Although no serious incident troubled the border patrols, which were anyway very lax, on the other hand, the sea patrols led to violent quarrels. The Deutschland affair. Even before the application of the control system, various incidents had already occurred, and British and French ships had been stopped and searched. But the only consequences had been protest notes from the governments concerned. The Deutschland affair had different repercussions. The powers that were supposed to be taking part in the patrols had sent warships to the Mediterranean. The latter refueled in friendly Spanish ports. Thus the naval base at Ibiza, in the Balearic Islands, acted as a gathering place for German warships. After various incidents in May 1937, the German pocket battleship Deutschland was seriously damaged during an attack on Ibiza by Republican aircraft. There were a number of killed and wounded. The Berlin government reacted vigorously. It was not content, like the others, with a note handed to the powers in charge of control. It intended to profit by the occasion and make a show of force. A naval action by Germany in the early months of the Civil War could have provoked a general conflict. But at the beginning of 1937, the atmosphere was relaxed. Great Britain and France had already made enough concessions. They no longer believed in the imminence of a world war. On May 31, 3 German warships, the pocket battleship Admiral Scheer and 2 destroyers, on orders from Berlin, shelled the port of Almeria. This shelling was presented as a simple reprisal raid. But there was no connection between the two incidents. On the one hand, a bombing raid within a war zone on enemy territory, and on the other, a spectacular operation deliberately carried out by a neutral power and taking the most shock form possible, that of an attack on an ill-defended town. It was in fact a genuine act of aggression by one of the powers entrusted with control at sea. Violent reactions were to be expected, from the Spanish Republicans as well as from the Western democracies. The tone of the press grew shriller. In Valencia, the Republican cabinet heard Prieto, the Minister of National Defense, propose a bombing attack on the German fleet in the Mediterranean. Such a retaliation meant war with Germany. Prieto realized this, but he hoped that a European war would follow, the only way, in his view, of saving Spain. However, most of the members of the Republican government refused to accept responsibility for such a conflict. In the end, since France and Britain eschewed any positive reaction, the German provocation remained unanswered. What is more, it was the Germans and Italians who voiced their indignation. Their representatives on the non-intervention committee stormed out. They returned in early June. After the bombing of the Deutschland came the incident of the Leipzig, attacked, according to the German government, by a submarine. Germany and Italy proposed a joint move against Valencia by the countries entrusted with control. France and Great Britain agreed to ask both Spanish sides to respect the warships, but they refused to be associated with a military action, claiming that in any case it had been impossible to identify the Leipzig's aggressor. They then suggested a commission of investigation, but ran into virtuous indignation from Berlin and Rome. The Axis delegates realized the impossibility of ensuring effective naval control, and on June 23 decided to give it up altogether. In such circumstances, border controls no longer made sense. Thus, on July 1, in conjunction with the Axis countries, Portugal decided to do away with the facilities granted for the control of frontiers. France, in desperation, followed suit on July 10. The control plan, which the non-intervention committee powers had taken 7.5 months to work out, had lasted precisely a month and a half. In the meantime, after the failure of its foreign policy, the Blum government had fallen. Certainly the non-intervention committee still existed, but it had lost the little authority it had. These 2 months had been the only ones in nearly 3 years of war in which it had played an even slightly effective role. Its failure amounted to a fresh defeat for the Western democracies. Faced with men who proudly boasted of practicing only the fascist law of the fait accompli, they had again proved by their neglect that they were ready to pay any price in order to keep the peace. Piracy in the Mediterranean the summer of 1937 had been notable for a fresh series of naval incidents. Attacks on Spanish and neutral merchant ships and warships on the high seas by planes and then by submarines. In August 1937, international relations were once again strained by the increase of such acts of piracy. A glance through the newspapers would produce details of this sort almost every day. On August 6, the British tanker British Corporal and the French liner Jebel Amour were bombed by planes. On 1 August there was an attack on a British warship, the destroyer Foxhound, off the northern coast of Spain. On August 13, the Edith, a Danish ship, went down. On August 15, the Panamanian tanker George McKnight was set on fire by a warship. Some Spanish government warships, like the Ciudad de Cadiz, sunk on August 16, were simultaneously attacked and torpedoed by submarines of unknown nationality, throughout the Mediterranean and as far away as the Dardanelles. Where did these attacks come from? The two Spanish governments mutually disclaimed any responsibility for them. In fact, the majority of the victims were either Spanish government ships or neutral ships, especially Soviet ones, belonging to powers in sympathy with the Spanish Republic. Some were transporting material destined for Republican Spain. Very quickly, a section of the press, in particular the British newspapers, named the aggressor. The planes that attacked the neutral warships turned out, in spite of vehement protests from Franco's general staff, to be nationalist planes, and the submarines probably were, too. There was even reference, at the time, to the Italian nationality of some of the aggressors. This hypothesis was later confirmed in Count Ciano's diaries. The latter stated unflinchingly that the authors of these acts of aggression were Italian warships, whether under the nationalist flag or not. On 3 August, Ciano drew up a provisional balance sheet on this matter. 4 Russian or Red ships sunk, 1 Greek ship captured, 1 Spanish ship bombed and forced to seek refuge in a French port. The objective in question was the sea blockade of Republican Spain. Franco himself explained this when he stated that the halting of ships transporting arms in the Mediterranean and the prevention of unloading in red ports were, for those nations concerned to see the war over, the most effective means of shortening it. In fact, it was privateering in a new guise during peacetime. Tolerant as the Western powers were, it was difficult for them not to react. The full Franco-Russo-British orchestra. The theme, piracy in the Mediterranean. Guilty. The fascists. At the time when Ciano wrote these lines, international opinion seemed to have been effectively aroused. This was because of a fresh naval incident, an attempt by a submarine of unknown nationality to torpedo the British destroyer Havoc. Actually, it was another Italian move, whose source Ciano indicated. The torpedo was fired by the Irede. This time it seems that London was no longer in a mood to settle for moral protests. Tension rose between Britain and Italy. The French government was also bent on showing greater firmness and decided to have its freighters in the Mediterranean escorted by warships. The fascist leaders were, for the first time, nonplussed. "I have arranged," said Ciano, for the dispatch of reinforcements to Spain to be deferred. And on September 4th, he noted, "I have ordered Cavagnari to suspend all naval activities until further notice." Thus, the first firm reaction by the Western governments was sufficient to check the inflammatory Italian policy, in spite of the pressure put on Rome by nationalist Spain. Franco says that the blockade will be decisive if it lasts all September. This is true, however, we must suspend it. Could there have been a clearer statement of Italy's determination not to become involved in a European war at this stage and under these conditions? However, neither the French government, in which socialist influence had declined, nor the British government, now led by Chamberlain, were anxious to go too far. They merely put to the Non-Intervention Committee a proposal for a conference to be held at Nyon on September 10th. The powers invited would all be states bordering the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, plus Germany and minus the two Spains. The official aim was to discuss means of ending piracy in the Mediterranean. But in a conference of this sort, procedure was as important as the problems broached. It was essential to know whether Italy would take part in the debate of her own free will and whether she would accept the role of the accused. The Russian government took advantage of the situation to prepare an extremely violent note attacking the fascist government. It was a genuine indictment. The motive invoked was the torpedoing of a Russian warship for which the Soviet Union was claiming reparation. Italy then refused to take part. Germany and Albania followed suit. The leaders of these countries asserted that, if the conference failed, it would be solely the fault of the USSR. However, the meeting opened on the agreed date. Was it a success? The Western states claimed that it was. Their press hailed the Nyon Agreement as a diplomatic triumph after the long series of reverses suffered in the preceding months. The decision taken to entrust the fight against piracy to the French and British fleets seemed to herald a radical change in attitude toward Italy, and consequently a new stand in the Spanish conflict. The Duce, on hearing these decisions, flew into a violent rage. But not too much notice needed to be taken of Mussolini's temper, because he was inclined to react violently to first impressions. The Western powers took up a forceful position at Nyon mainly in order to have a basis for negotiations. An initial sop was immediately given to the Italians. The USSR was excluded from control. Moreover, the British and French governments sought to obtain the participation of Italy herself in the agreement. Possibly, by making overtures to Italy and not to Germany, they hoped to set the two powers against each other. But this was to misunderstand an alliance based both on complementary interests and on a mutual need for security. Italy could take part in control of the Mediterranean without weakening the Rome-Berlin axis. When approached, she made one condition: equality with France and Britain in the controls. "We are shifting," Chano wrote in his diary, "from the role of torpedo launchers which had been allotted to us to that of Mediterranean policemen, whereas the Russians, sunk without trace, are excluded from control." Italian piracy did not in the end persuade the Western powers to make a gesture in support of the Spanish Republic any more than the shelling of Almeria. Russia's political isolation, which the London discussions had underlined, was further aggravated. This was undoubtedly one of the reasons behind the diplomatic change of course taken by Stalin, who was convinced that he had nothing to expect from the Western democracies. This was the outcome of Great Britain's pacifist policy. The triumph of Chamberlain's policy. British policy had not, since the beginning of the war, supported the Republican government. Eden did not show, any more than Baldwin, the slightest understanding of the Spanish ambassador Ascarit's requests. At least the British government had observed the forms of strict neutrality. But the British conservatives were no friendlier than Franco supporters to those whom they still regarded as Reds. In the beginning, they were mainly concerned with bringing about a mediation that would lead to a compromise peace. Since this peace could only be guaranteed by an international entente, or rather by a Mediterranean entente, the aim of British diplomacy was therefore to ensure peace in the Mediterranean by maintaining the status quo. These views were in no sense inimical to those of Franco who, in the face of his Italian allies, insisted imperatively on the maintenance of the integrity of Spanish territory. By the end of 1936, the Chano-Drummond talks made it clear that nothing could be done to alter the existing situation in the Mediterranean. It was without doubt the crisis brought about by piracy in the Mediterranean that had broken off Anglo-Italian relations. but they were renewed in November 1937 through the efforts of the British Premier, Chamberlain. On November 16, the British government had decided, in order to protect its interests, to make a de facto recognition of the Burgos government. It therefore sent a representative to nationalist Spain, Robert Hodgson, who in practice carried out the functions of an ambassador. Similarly, the agents posted to Spanish towns held the rank of consul. Franco was represented in Great Britain by one of the leading figures in the regime, the Duke of Alba, who arrived in London on November 22. This exchange of plenipotentiaries heralded a rapprochement between Britain and nationalist Spain already initiated in the commercial field. The conquest of the North, where the British had vast interests, had undoubtedly been the decisive factor explaining this evolution. It was not long before Hodgson was wielding real influence in Burgos, and from then on efforts to reach a compromise peace were directed at securing a nationalist victory under the least violent conditions possible. But this was where the differences between the British leaders began. Although they all regarded a Franco victory as inevitable and thought that, after all, it was convenient, there was a minority within the government whose most influential member was Anthony Eden, who felt that an entente with fascism in the Mediterranean was a delusion. The application of a diplomatic agreement between Britain and Italy meant the elimination of this minority. After a meeting between Grandi, the Italian ambassador in London, Eden, and Chamberlain, the differences between the last two became obvious, especially on the question of foreign volunteers in Spain. Eden had to resign, which was hailed by the Axis diplomats as a victory. Great Britain's policy took a final turn. An agreement between Britain and Italy was drawn up by Count Chano and Lord Perth, the British charge in Rome. Chano wanted to avoid making difficulties for the Chamberlain government and was therefore ready to make concessions. The Entente was concluded at the end of 1937, in spite of fresh incidents in the Mediterranean. But for the agreement to be applied, the war had to end. At the beginning of 1938, the Republican disaster in Aragon seemed to reinforce this prospect. France's final hesitations, the Barcelona government had not yet given up all hope, nor had it surrendered all its claims to help from outside. French support was still conceivable, especially in March 1938, with Blum's return to the government. According to Negrin, Blum, even before taking over the cabinet, had asked him to come to Paris and discuss methods of material aid with certain influential Frenchmen. Negrin had made the journey and had met Blum, Daladier, and Paul Boncourt. An agreement had then been reached on arms supplies. In fact, at the time of the Aragon campaign, the second Blum government had considered going further in terms of intervention. With the Republican collapse, when a general advance by the nationalists in Catalonia was to be expected, there had been serious talk in France of a military intervention that would take the form of occupying this province of Spain. The French government was no doubt relying on thus having a pawn for political negotiations. The ministers had envisaged, according to Blum himself, a rapid move carried out by mechanized units. But at a meeting of the French National Defense Council, the French military leaders had stated that they could not act without a mobilization order. On the other hand, there is no doubt that such a step would have seriously risked setting off a European conflict. If France sent, in articulo mortis men and air material, we would intervene in force, said Chano. Thus Blum was faced for the second time with the alternatives of peace or war. When Morel, the French military attaché in Madrid, was consulted by the Premier as to the possibilities of military action, he replied, "I have only one thing to tell you. A king of France would go to war." But, said Blum, I was not the king of France. By giving up the idea of direct intervention for the second time, the French government in March 1938 also gave up the idea of effectively defending the Spanish Republican government. The dispatch of French arms and the free passage permitted to cargoes of foreign material were not enough to alter the course of events. The Blum government was replaced in April by a Daladier ministry, which was joined by Georges Bonnet, supporter of an entente with the Axis powers. France, in her turn, was preparing to abandon the Barcelona government. However, it was advisable to preserve appearances, to show that an international agreement could restore the conflict's truly Spanish character, and finally to reach agreement on the withdrawal of volunteers, which had been fruitlessly discussed ever since the establishment of the Non-Intervention Committee. The London Plan during the course of summer 1937, the British government tried to revive discussion on this subject. A plan was communicated on July 14th to the powers concerned, which contained 4 points. Renewal of control according to a different system. Stationing of neutral agents in Spanish ports to exercise control previously entrusted to the Navy, and the reestablishment of border controls. 2. Since it was necessary for both sides to undertake to permit neutral observers to operate, belligerent rights would be granted to them both. 4. These operations would take place in the following order: stationing of international officials in foreign ports, withdrawal of volunteers, recognition of belligerent rights. In this way, the issue of the withdrawal of volunteers and the issue of belligerent rights were linked, as Italy and Germany had been requesting since 1936. But what at the beginning of the conflict would have represented a serious problem of equity had only a limited interest and bearing in July 1937. Once again, the Axis powers found it necessary to drag out the talks. The British plan was merely a basis for negotiations. But why did the French government agree to let itself be led on in this way from discussion to discussion over months and years? The Civil War had begun in July 1936, and the British control plan had been put forward 1 year later. And on November 9, 1938, in an article in Le Populaire, Blum once again raised the question, must the London Plan be applied? The London Plan was never applied, mainly because of Russian opposition, hostile to any form of recognition of the Burgos government, a position that the USSR confirmed at a meeting of the Non-Intervention Committee in late October 1937. Italy, Portugal, and Germany took advantage of it to state that they could not vote for the resolution until unanimity had been reached. Faithful, nevertheless, to the attitude that had been theirs from the start, the Axis powers were still trying to get the talks going again. The German government proposed a compromise, a symbolic gesture, consisting of withdrawing a certain number of volunteers from each side. The theoretical nature of this proposal did not arouse great enthusiasm at the time. Once again there was impasse. However, during the course of summer 1938, a change of tack occurred. The delegates on the committee agreed to work out the application of the British plan. Britain congratulated herself. The policy of non-intervention has achieved its goal, declared Chamberlain, while Butler announced to the House of Commons, the system of surveillance will be re-established, and the system of naval control come into force under its new formula when the International Commission for Controlling the Withdrawal of Volunteers is ready to start its enumeration. The new factor was the unanimity achieved by the Non-Intervention Committee. This was due basically to the shift in Russian policy. Moscow was now actually in favor of the plan for naval control. The explanation for this change was given in detail by Schulenburg, the German ambassador in Moscow. The Soviet government feels that a victory by the Reds is quite unlikely and consequently believes it preferable to prepare public opinion for a negotiated peace. This explanation was doubtless only a partial one. Certainly the Republican defeats must have induced the USSR to adopt an increasingly cautious attitude, but it is likely that the shift initially derived from overall Russian policy. This was the starting point of an evolution that led, a year after the dropping of Spain, to the signing of the Soviet-German Pact. In the meantime, the prolongation of the war deferred the threat of a conflict in Central Europe. With such future dangers in mind, the USSR was not anxious to become openly divorced from the Western democracies, with which she had common interests. The withdrawal of the volunteers be that as it may, on July 5th an agreement was reached by the Non-Intervention Committee on the plan for the withdrawal of volunteers. As Germany had requested, the belligerent rights of both parties would be recognized as soon as 10,000 men had been withdrawn from each side. 2 commissions stood ready. The first had to find a way of counting the volunteers still scattered about both Spains. The General Secretary of the committee, Hemming, was given the task of obtaining agreement from the Spanish authorities. But Franco's clear-cut hostility prevented him from completing his mission. The Second Commission, far more active, moved into Toulouse in August. This was the Commission for the Exchange of Prisoners, led by Field Marshal Sir Philip Chetwode. It contributed to the organization of many exchanges, and it is probable that Chetwode and his colleagues, Cowan in Republican Spain and Mosley in Nationalist Spain, made an effective contribution toward preparations for the end of the conflict. By contrast, the evacuation of foreigners fighting in Spain produced a diplomatic comedy on both sides. It was carried out without any supervision, but to the accompaniment of spectacular ceremonies, processions, and moving farewells. Negrin spoke to the men of the international brigades. The members of the CTV evacuated from Spain were given a resounding welcome on their arrival in Naples, but the troops evacuated in fact consisted only of sick and wounded, or at least of weary men who, on the Italian side, were at once replaced by fresh troops. No one, however, was taken in. The Germans and Italians accused the Republicans of having taken steps to camouflage their volunteers, and Weizsäcker wrote, "In fact, no evacuation of Red volunteers has occurred, whatever may have been said. Only the French wounded have been taken charge of by France." The Axis spokesman contrasted the Italian attitude with this breach of the commitments made. It was true that a certain number of Italians had been evacuated, 11,000 apparently, but it must be mentioned in precisely what conditions. According to a note from the Wilhelmstrasse, Berti, the commander-in-chief of the Italians, gave Franco the choice of three proposals: the dispatch of 2 to 3 new divisions, the dispatch of 10,000 men to compensate for losses, or the total or partial withdrawal of the Italians. This final measure was feasible because the military capacity of the nationalist army had been strengthened. But total withdrawal was not to Franco's taste, nor to Mussolini's. Thus they insisted on a measure that could not weaken the nationalist war potential. The departure of part of the infantry would be compensated by the reinforcement of the specialist troops and the air force. It was only after this agreement that a token evacuation took place. The Germans, who had not been involved in these dealings, had completely reformed the Condor Legion since July 1938. In this way, discussions on volunteers ended. The non-intervention committee still existed, but its role was negligible. Its 30th and last sitting took place on May 19, 1939, after the end of the conflict. Conscious of its futility, it proceeded to dissolve itself. Munich and Spain, the Spaniards and the European crisis. The death sentence on Republican Spain, accepted since summer 1938 by France and Russia, became final after Munich. At this point, Negrin and Del Valle, like Prieto at the time of Almeria, felt that the European war was inevitable and that it was the Republic's only hope of victory. Although the Spanish Republic's diplomatic position had been weakened, the chances of an international conflict had greatly increased. The Anschluss had been a prelude to Hitler's widespread annexations. Then came the territorial claims on the Sudetenland. Italy was certainly ill-prepared for war and weakened by the Spanish adventure. But her alliance with Germany was firmer than ever. France and Britain had drawn closer together and had guaranteed Czechoslovakia's frontiers. The political situation in Europe was so tense that the Spanish question had slipped to second place among international preoccupations. However, in the event of war, the Negrin government had made up its mind to take a stand at once and to force the hand of France and Britain by siding with them and declaring war on Germany and Italy, whose troops were occupying part of its territory. It was in fact left to the Republic to reverse a situation that daily grew worse. Its political abandonment by the great powers led to a change of attitude among the smaller states, which naturally turned to the strongest. Until then, Germany, Italy, and Portugal had been isolated and in a minority of the non-intervention committee. In January 1938, Hungary, Austria, and Albania, future victims of fascist ambitions, took sides with them. 11 states had now given General Franco's regime de jure or de facto recognition. The Republicans wanted to convince the Western powers that they did not represent a dangerous revolutionary force and that the period of anarchy was now over. The Negrin government symbolized the maintenance of authority. There had been no opposition since Prieto's departure. Negrin was himself shouldering the essential responsibilities of the state. He was not only premier, but also foreign minister, minister of national defense, and minister of the interior. His friends liked to compare him to Clemenceau, and he undeniably had the same determination to identify himself with the country at war. Authority and national unity were being maintained at the expense of the Basque and Catalan autonomous movements. In August 1938, the resignation of the Catalan minister Aiguade and the Basque Arujo, replaced by Moix Regis of the PSUC and the socialist Bilbao Hospitalet, clearly indicated, in spite of official protests, the strengthening of the central authority. In the same way, the policy of religious tolerance practiced by Negrin was inspired by the wish to win the sympathy of the Western world. While Arujo was a minister, he fought for freedom of worship. He had very soon forced the concession that the denunciation of priests for the mere fact of practicing the priesthood should be regarded as an offense. Private masses were authorized, and on August 15, 1937, the first official mass was celebrated in the building of the Basque delegation in Valencia. Of course, this did not mean that the Catholic Church had had its prerogatives restored. The first publicly authorized religious burial was regarded as a magnificent proof of the government's tolerance. But less spectacular measures were effective in other ways, such as the decision by Negrin to exempt religious objects from the general rules governing the requisition of precious metals, and in particular the 1938 measures, which exempted priests from active duty and drafted them into medical and welfare services, and which authorized them to enter prisons to minister to the men there, especially the condemned men. All these decisions tended to reassure foreigners. It was possible to get along with such a regime, to help it to win or at least retain the essentials by means of an honorable compromise. Moreover, the Czech crisis roused great hope among the Republicans. In the event of a conflict, Franco-Spain would soon find herself in an untenable military situation. The nationalists did not have adequate reserves to hold an additional front. According to von Funk, the German military attaché in San Sebastian, Franco himself had stated that he had never had any reserves, and that with every attack by the Reds, he had had to call a halt to the offensive in order to meet them. Certainly the Pyrenees provided a natural defense, but Franco knew quite well that it was not adequate. He had sent thousands of prisoners to the two frontiers in the north and the south to prepare fortifications. On the other hand, his army still depended on supplies of material from Italy and Germany. The halting of deliveries of ammunition during the Czech crisis had already put his troops in a difficult situation. Quite clearly, in the event of a European conflict, the collapse of Spain within a short space of time was to be expected. Even Franco's supporters knew this, and the Germans thought that the Caudillo would then be reduced to retiring and handing over to a more moderate figure the task of winding up the civil war. Franco had stopped receiving encouragement and promises from his allies. He was not even kept abreast of the political situation by the German government. Anxiety increased at nationalist headquarters. Franco's general staff is very depressed, said Storer, and is unable to conceal its displeasure with U.S. To this displeasure must be added the displays of bad temper against Souffire, which inspired fears of a revived opposition in nationalist Spain. To ensure victory, Franco had to make absolutely certain, in the event of a European conflagration, of the neutrality of the great powers, and in particular of France. Nationalist neutrality in the Czech crisis from 18 to September 28. The diplomatic efforts of nationalist Spain were aimed at getting the Western powers to agree first to keep the Spanish affair separate from the impending European war, and afterward to accept the nationalist government's neutrality, which would be equivalent on their side to a final refusal to support the Spanish Republic. The Western powers' position was precarious. They did not have a united front. The Chamberlain government would only go to war against the Axis as a last resort. Russian aid to Czechoslovakia was problematical. France would therefore be isolated in the event of war and obliged to divest its eastern frontiers in order to launch the anticipated twofold attack against nationalist Spain through Catalonia and Morocco. The French General Staff would unquestionably prefer not to have to fight an additional enemy. Thus, when Jordana and Franco undertook to observe the strictest neutrality in the event of a European conflict, the British and French governments showed satisfaction at the promises made directly by the Caudillo and passed on to Paris and London by Quiñones de Leon and the Duke of Alba. This declaration of neutrality still had to be accepted by the Axis powers, and this was a very difficult matter. Nationalist diplomacy had exhibited great shrewdness in this respect. First, it had deliberately revealed its fear of a war that might do it harm. Then it had deplored the fact that its allies left it in ignorance of how the political situation was developing. On this point, however, Franco had no difficulty in finding cause for complaint. In reality, Franco was not afraid that Spain would be neglected, but that too much attention would be paid to her during the course of negotiations at which he would not be represented. It was not impossible that the Axis powers would abandon their Spanish ally or that Germany would make use of her forces in Spain and the Mediterranean for military action in the event of war. The arrival of the Deutschland in Vigo, like the presence of the Italians in Majorca, could legitimately give rise to fears in this respect. Finally, the European political crisis, by reviving hopes in the Republican camp, could provoke disturbances and even actual revolts in nationalist Spain. These fears explain the Burgos government's neutralist attitude. On September 26, the German leaders were told about it. On the 27th, Jordana officially passed on this decision to the German and Italian ambassadors. Apparently, it was a question of benevolent neutrality. But the fact remains that Franco had presented his allies with a fait accompli. He expected to be approved, but he only informed them once his decision had been taken. How, in such circumstances, could there have been surprise at the violent reactions from German and Italian diplomats? The Italians were especially furious. Their leaders felt that the sacrifices made for the nationalist cause ought to be repaid there and then. "Our dead should be turning in their graves," wrote Chano. The Germans were more reserved, but no less shocked at the Spaniards' haste in proclaiming their neutrality. They considered the move premature, to say the least. The Italians and Germans were also anxious about the fate that awaited their troops fighting in Spain in the event of war. No doubt Jordana had stated that these troops would be regarded and treated as Spanish soldiers. But could it be believed that France, at war with Germany, would tolerate the presence of enemy soldiers in a so-called neutral country? On receiving the news of Spanish neutrality, Chano's instinctive reaction was to consider the immediate evacuation of the Italian troops. In spite of the precautions taken by the nationalist government, it was clear that a European conflict would threaten all the successes won up till then. And the representatives of both Spains were perfectly aware that their fate hung in the balance beyond their own frontiers. Once again, the reluctance of the Western powers determined Spain's fate. In August-September 1936, the comedy of non-intervention had played into the hands of the fascist states. In September 1938, the Munich capitulation did not merely deliver up Czechoslovakia to Hitler, it utterly extinguished the last hope of Spanish democracy. This dawn of peace has sounded the knell of red tyranny. The efforts of our armies will soon lead to victorious peace. From this point on, in fact, the great powers' first preoccupation was to put an end to the civil war. The winners at Munich had realized that, in the event of a general conflict, nationalist Spain would be a millstone around their necks if the civil war continued. The Western powers had not been altogether unhappy about Franco's attitude at the time of the Munich crisis. Russia was pulling out for good. France herself, reassured by the Cautelos position, was considering establishing diplomatic relations with the nationalists. In early 1939, Leon Berard was given the task of negotiating de facto recognition of the Burgos government. In spite of his known sympathy for the nationalists, he ran into unconcealed ill will. Franco demanded de jure recognition and asked the French to hand over to him Spanish property in France, war material, and the gold in the Bank of Spain, among other things. For the time being, negotiations were suspended. At the end of the Civil War, however, the Pétain mission renewed apparently cordial relations, and finally all the nationalist government's requests were accepted. By October 1938, the only question was to know how Franco's final victory could be assured. Storer explained how the intervention of the powers could induce the moderate elements among the Reds to lay down their arms, which seemed to anticipate by a few months the action of the Casado junta in destroying the Republican positions. The Storer plan excluded the Communists from negotiations and seemed to exclude Negrin. However, the latter did not close the door on a peaceful solution of the conflict. In a 13-point speech, he outlined the conditions required for a compromise between the two sides. On October 1938, in a speech to the Cortes, he accepted the principle of mediation. A few days later, he admitted that a plebiscite could be a solution. But could a compromise acceptable to all Spaniards really be found? The mere word, mediation, or compromise, provoked a violent reaction from many of the leaders in nationalist Spain. Each time he had spoken on this subject, Franco had been categorical. There was no question of anything but capitulation. And the San Sebastian Diario Vasco came up with this colorful formula, which put nationalist thinking in a nutshell: we do not want a pact with the devil, we want the peace of conquest. Chapter 21. The Battle of the Ebro and the Campaign in Catalonia. The offensive, a political necessity. The final abandonment of the Republic had coincided with the fall of the Second Blum government. At that point, the nationalists' victory in Aragon, severing Catalonia from the Republic, gave the impression that a collapse might occur at any time, shattering the Republican front. It is true that the offensive in the direction of Valencia had slowed in front of the line at Viver, but after a big military thrust a period of regrouping and readaptation is always to be expected. Moreover, the attacks on Vivre did not cease until July 23, granting no respite to the weary government troops, morally weakened by retreat and by the certainty of fighting on their last line of defense from then on. Their severance from Catalonia prevented any material aid from being brought across the French frontier. To become involved in fighting in such circumstances could have been disastrous. It was at this juncture that, in order to save Valencia and make a final effort to regroup the Republican forces, the Republican General Staff tried to recover the initiative. This was the Ebro offensive, whose launching surprised not only the Spanish, but also the foreign powers, who were scarcely counting on another large-scale Republican action. Rojo observed that it had become necessary to make a gigantic effort in the military as well as in the international field. Since the beginning of 1938, tension had once again built up between the Western powers and Germany. As the first typical Hitler annexation, the Anschluss heralded further territorial claims. The European war was being prepared in Central Europe. At the same time, the Negrin government once again saw a chance of internationalizing the conflict. Once again it was necessary to prove to Europe and the world that the reverses they had suffered had not shaken the Republicans' determination to fight on, that the morale of the troops was still intact. In short, that the movement that had aroused the Spanish people in 1936 had been able to resist both time and the hardships of war. Possibly Negrin also had it in mind to prove that the outcome of the struggle was still a long way off, and that the adversaries had to accept a compromise. The Ebro offensive was therefore as much a political as a military operation. But why choose the Ebro sector, which, by requiring the crossing of the river at a difficult place, presented an additional danger? There were in fact only two means of saving Valencia. Either a direct counterattack to the north of Sagunta, leading to the recapture of part of the land lost during the preceding months and the relief of the capital of the Levant, but this operation would have been seriously compromised from the start by the weariness of the troops involved, the lack of reserves, and the gaps already made in the Madrid, Extremadura, and Andalusian fronts, or else a large-scale action in another vital sector, preventing the resumption of the nationalist offensive against Valencia. The first objective of the Republican General Staff was to force the nationalists to divert their attention from the Levant to Catalonia. The forces that were to take part in the attack had been regrouped in the north. They were still well organized and admirably prepared for the surprise action that had to be carried out before the crossing of the river. Certain problems were obviously difficult to solve, especially the need to cross the Ebro with heavy equipment in order to achieve the second objective, a breach of the nationalist front, leading to the recovery of part of the Mediterranean coast. In fact, only total success could prove that the Republican army was still capable of winning. But if the operation miscarried from the start, a setback like this threatened to end in disaster. The General Staff had certainly taken a risk, but it was a calculated risk. It was in fact no longer possible to remain passive. A complete victory was unthinkable, given the balance of power, but a local success was both necessary and possible. The crossing of the Ebro, the place where the offensive was to be launched, had been fixed since June. General Rojo pointed out in this regard that the General Staff's initially lofty ambitions had eventually been confined to the following objective: forcing a crossing of the Ebro on both sides of the loop, occupying the heights to the south, and making a deep thrust. Two complementary actions were to accompany this main though limited action, one toward the west on the Fayón-Mequinenza axis, in a move to sever the communications of the nationalist troops and to hamper the arrival of reinforcements, and the other toward the coast, which would merely be a diversion. On the whole, the government ambitions were relatively modest, although substantial forces were committed. The Army of the Ebro, reinforced by a certain number of divisions from the Army of the East. But the delays necessary for concentrating men and arms, for collecting the boats that were to aid the first crossings, and for the arrival of the component parts of the bridges that were to be thrown across the river meant that the start of the offensive had to be deferred. All this dragged on for about 2 months. In spite of everything, the element of surprise was almost complete. On the night of 24 to 25 July, the boats were discreetly positioned. The attack by small assault groups with a commando mission reflected both the means and the best utilization of the Republican soldiers. Success was nearly complete, although the technical services, as always in the Republican Army, proved inadequate. Thus, communications between the General Staff, posted a few miles from the river, and the 5th Army Corps were severed during the early hours of the attack. The news of the attack during the same night was good. Bridgeheads had been established, footbridges and transport bridges had been put in position, and the crossing of the river at 2 points began at dawn. Thrusting toward Villalba on the one side and toward Gandesa and Corbera on the other, the two pincers of the Republican offensive closed on a pocket occupying the furthest point of the loop, with its center at Mora del Ebro. On the 26th, Corbera was occupied and the outskirts of Villalba and Gandesa reached. The pocket at Mora del Ebro was wiped out in a few days. The bridgehead across the Ebro was then 12 miles deep and 18 miles wide. To the north, the crossing by the 42nd Division meant that a subsidiary bridgehead between Fayon and Mequinenza had been established, which interfered with the arrival of nationalist reinforcements. Altogether, 50,000 men had crossed the Ebro, in spite of an immediate and violent reply by nationalist aircraft. But once again, the advantages gained were limited, because there was never any question of exploiting this success. There was an inadequate concentration of troops and a shortage of reserves. After 5 days of tough fighting, the men taking part in the battle were tired. In spite of continuous efforts, neither Villalba nor Gandesa had been occupied. The nationalists, falling back on the villages, had held on. As soon as they had been faced with a heavy concentration of fire, the Republicans had been forced to halt their attacks. In the early hours of the fighting, there had been a shortage of heavy equipment, especially armor. By the time the 24-ton tanks had managed to cross, there had been time for nationalist aid to arrive. By the 25th, the nationalists' air superiority was obvious. Bombing and machine gun raids inflicted considerable damage on the convoys crossing the Ebro. Certainly reinforcements were still arriving, because night crossings had not been effectively interrupted, but the first bridges were destroyed by the activities of the bombers and the opening of the dams on the Ebro's tributaries in the Pyrenees. The position of the Republican troops in the bridgehead was constantly being threatened. The battle of attrition. On August 1st, the real battle began. The nationalists were intent on hurling their opponents back across the river. The Republicans were determined to hold on. The fighting that ensued went on until November 15th. The government forces showed, as they had at Teruel, that they were capable of tenacity in the most difficult of circumstances. But the army of the Ebro had to embark on a battle of attrition, a battle of equipment. However much courage it showed, it could not emerge victorious from such a confrontation. It was, said Rojo, a fight between plenty and poverty. The protraction of the fighting had only one meaning: to give foreigners the idea that there was still a balance of forces in Spain, at a time when the Czech crisis was breaking in Europe. At this point, European reconciliation was brought about in Munich, and hopes of foreign intervention vanished. Henceforth, the Battle of the Ebro became not only pointless but dangerous for the Republicans. The loss of Catalonia, wrote Ulibarri, was determined on the Ebro. Without doubt, a withdrawal to the left bank in the early days of August would have avoided more serious reverses and the enormous casualties incurred afterward by the Republicans. But the respite given to the armies in the center had been too brief and, more important, the abandonment of the bridgehead, after the blaring victory communiques, would have caused a reaction disastrous for the morale of the army and the rear. Also, in spite of the presence of substantial forces on the nationalist side, the Barcelona General Staff dug in its heels and resisted. Possibly the Republican command was more willing to accept a defensive war than broad-scale maneuvers. The troops that were holding the bridgehead had gained certain advantages. In particular, the possession of the main observation points in the area strengthened their position. The successes won in the early days and the confusion and irresolution that they had noticed among the enemy increased their courage and tenacity. At the start of the offensive, they were faced by comparatively limited forces. Thus, with the exception of Amposta, the whole zone of attack was protected solely by the 50th Division. The Nationalist General Staff was relying mainly on the natural protection afforded by the river and the normal sluggishness of government operations. It was deceived on both these points. Although, in the early stages of the offensive, certain nationalist officers had been optimistic, by the dawn of the 25th the tone of the communiques had changed. The news had become frankly bad. In spite of the mass of material flung hurriedly into the battle, all the available artillery and aircraft, it took a week to re-establish normal battle conditions and to stabilize the front. 7 divisions had been successively placed at the disposal of the Moroccan Army Corps in order to restore the situation. General Franco had been forced to withdraw troops from the Levant and even from some other sectors on the Central Front, and to transfer them to the Ebro. As at Teruel, he had agreed to fight on the terrain chosen by his enemies. But he accepted this challenge because he was confident of his daily increasing material superiority. On such a narrow front, victory could only be won by pounding the enemy with artillery fire and aircraft. Franco felt that this was now possible. The Republicans had hung on to and had moved up reinforcements. For weeks, the adversaries persisted, bringing up new means and fresh troops, until the point when the terrible casualties incurred by both sides forced one of the combatants to leave the field. The Battle of the Ebro had been even bloodier than Teruel. It too had changed into a battle of annihilation, but this time the fighting was to be decisive. To start with, the nationalist counteroffensive worked out well. The Féon bridgehead had been reduced. The concentration of troops and especially of artillery, its extraordinary density, pointed to a rapid victory. The Republican 42nd Division was practically annihilated. But this was only a local success. The decisive battle took place around the Gandesa bridgehead. The Nationalists met with an initial failure here. The attack launched before August 10th against the Sierra de Pandals met with bitter resistance. Unlike anything else in the whole of the war, said Aznar. In practical terms, the gains made were non-existent. In August and September the attacks continued, barely interrupted by a few periods of calm, which enabled the troops, who had suffered heavy casualties on each occasion, to reform. There were 4 offensives before October. These were not, strictly speaking, large-scale military actions, but localized actions around several points that were taken and retaken. More than at Teruel, where the harshness of the fighting was due mainly to weather conditions, the Battle of the Ebro, because of its length, its harshness, and its stubbornness, revived memories of the fighting in the Great War. It was the Spanish Verdun. But the adversaries could not endure such a cadence of almost uninterrupted destruction indefinitely. The enormous losses of men and material eventually led to the exhaustion of the Republican forces. By the end of October, reserves had become inadequate. On the nationalist side, on the other hand, it had been possible to prepare reinforcements. A new army corps of the Mestrago was formed. Led by General Garcia Villino, it consisted of 5 divisions. On October 24, General Order No. 44 to the Nationalists ordered them to reduce the pocket formed on the Ebro. In fact, the attack only really began after November 1st. The scaling of the Republican positions in the Sierra de Cabals was managed by surprise. Between the 1st and the 8th of November, the whole of the southeastern part of the bridgehead, as far as Mora del Ebro, was occupied. The second phase of the offensive ended on November 15th. The government forces had lost all the ground won since the beginning of the fighting. The Republican Army had proved that it was capable of fighting and holding on, in spite of its material inferiority, but the casualties incurred, possibly some 100,000 men killed, wounded, and taken prisoner, had bled it white and had undeniably opened the way to defeat. There is no doubt that the front stabilized itself after November 15th. On the other hand, the offensive launched in Estremadura in the direction of Cabeza del Buey and Almaden, an offensive that had made rapid progress during August, was finally blocked by the Republicans, thanks to support by troops from the Levant. The Battle of the Ebro, by luring away the best nationalist troops, had given the Central Zone an appreciable respite. Miaja had taken advantage of it to reorganize his troops. But since Franco's victory in Aragon, Spain had been divided. The troops in Catalonia had had no relief. They were exhausted by the fighting they had had to endure. They needed a long period of calm and arms reinforcements to be able to meet a vast nationalist offensive with a single solid front. But this was not to be. The weariness caused by the war became more and more obvious with each military failure. The successes won on the Ebro in July had boosted the morale of the rear for a while. But since then, the ground won had been retaken by the nationalists. Hopes of aid from outside had ended with Munich. Prieto's theory, "Europe has betrayed us," was agreed to by many. To Catalonia, which had been the home of the anarchist revolution and the scene of the May Days, Europe's betrayal was like the condemnation of Negrin's policy. The revolution had been abandoned, and Europe was now backing Franco. For the first time in Catalonia, the rear began to weaken. To make Barcelona another Madrid was now impossible. Conditions were no longer what they had been in 1936. Nor was faith. Catalonia before the attack, can it at least be said that the government had gained in authority what it had lost in popularity? Even this is disputable. The Socialist Party was deeply divided in spite of the apparent reconciliation among its various shades of opinion. The communist upsurge had crystallized the hostility of the other parties toward this encroaching partner. The army had never stopped being influenced by politics. On the other hand, the lack of imported goods, the progressive halting of trade as a result of the blockade, lack of money, and the ill will of foreign countries slowly paralyzed life in Catalonia. Just when industry should have been developed to the full, production was slowing down. There were not enough raw materials. Agricultural production was also slipping back. Many peasants were at the front, others were not delivering their goods. Food supplies became more and more difficult to obtain. In November, faced with the difficulties that another winter of war presaged, the government had created, under the chairmanship of the Minister of National Defense, a food supply coordinating committee, which was to coordinate all activities dealing with production, the sale of foodstuffs, and essential clothing. It was a question of distributing food, giving priority to the fighting men, then to the armed forces in the rear, and finally to the civilian population, beginning with children, the sick, and workers in war industries. But this organ soon found itself up against insurmountable obstacles. It should be added that throughout Catalonia, and especially in Barcelona, Franco's supporters were still numerous and active. With the collapse of Catalonia, this fifth column showed its face, especially in the last hours of the defense of Barcelona. Finally, morale in the rear was sapped by incessant bombing raids on the Catalan capital. Everything was conspiring toward the defeat of the Republic in Catalonia. The Nationalist Army Corps were deployed on a front running along the Ebro to the tributary of the Segre, and then rising toward the Pyrenees, following the Segre and the Noguera, because the towns staked out by this front line, Lerida, Balaguer, and Tremp, were in nationalist hands. The loss of Barcelona on December 23, the offensive against Catalonia opened. In theory, the Republican forces were still made up of two armies. In the north, starting from the French frontier, the Army of the East. In the south, the Army of the Ebro. Their inferiority in men and material was such that, after the Battle of the Ebro, the Republicans were almost incapable of carrying out any sort of offensive action. According to Ulibarri, each brigade lacked from 600 to 1,000 men of the 3,600 that made up their full strength. All in all, the Republican command could put 90,000 men on the front but did not have any reserves. The 11th and 12th Army Corps of the Army of the East had to bear the full brunt of the attack. A two-pronged nationalist assault made a breach in the Segre front. After a weak artillery barrage, an attack by Italian armor provoked a stampede. The 16th Division, held in reserve, retreated instead of defending its positions. The breach thus created made a large-scale counterattack difficult. The attempt made on December 25 led to almost total failure. Its only result was slightly to slow down the advance of the CTV and the Navarrese. Finally, in order to attempt a new offensive action, the Army of the Ebro had to be reinforced with contingents. The campaign in Catalonia, January-February 1939. The fighting had now been going on for 10 days. It was practically impossible in the Republican Army to relieve the fighting units. Weariness and a sense of impotence were now added to material inferiority. The fighters no longer even tried to hinder the nationalist air raids and only appeared after the fighting. The inhabitants of Barcelona christened them the Arco de Iris, the rainbow. The morale of the troops, especially that of the new recruits, slumped daily. The collapse occurred in the early days of January. While the Italian attack resulted in a breakthrough toward Borjas Blancas, the Nationalist Army Corps of Aragon and the Mestrago made rapid progress in the Tremp area, threatening to isolate the Republican forces in their positions facing Lerida. All the power stations in the Lerida area, the most important in Spain, fell into nationalist hands. The Barcelona General Staff gave the order to fall back. The front line literally burst open. The nationalist offensive became a general one. The 6th Army Corps fanned out, making use of armor by January 6th. There was no longer any question of offensive action. "All we can do," said Rojo, "is defend." In fact, it was mainly a question of knowing how long the Republicans could resist, avoid encirclement and isolation, and protect the roads that led to the Pyrenean frontier. The Nationalists did not even need to initiate a breakthrough, as before. With 6 army corps in the line, they were already vastly superior in numbers to the forces mustered by the 7 Republican Army Corps, and they gave proof of a daily more overwhelming material superiority. The Republican artillery was, according to Rojo, reduced to a sixth of the opposing artillery. Individual arms were in short supply, 60,000 rifles, insufficient to arm all the combatants. Certainly, an effort was still possible. The Barcelona government attempted one by mobilizing all men of fighting age, but this mobilization, even if it had been completed, would have barely altered the situation, because there were no arms to be issued. And then this mass levy had an absurd side to it. Under pretext of bringing up to the front troops whom it was not even possible to use, the firemen were mobilized in Barcelona, a town bombed daily and that had as many as 5 or 6 alerts a day. From 20 to January 26th, the life of the city was completely disrupted. In fact, the battle that took place for the possession of the town had been lost in advance. The army of the Ebro, heavily committed to the south, had to abandon the southern triangle defended by Tarragona in order to avoid encirclement. The loss of this town was the prelude to the collapse of the front. It added to the immense chaos by forcing droves of refugees to the north, who encumbered the roads of Catalonia. They were already crowding into Barcelona, even sleeping on the platforms of the subway, which was being used both as shelters and dormitories. Evidently, the military leaders, the commissars, and the representatives of the parties and unions still hoped, on January 24th, to sustain a long defense. A substantial propaganda campaign had been waged. Everywhere streamers were hung and posters were put up. Catalonia is in danger. Everyone to arms. Or win this battle and we shall win the war. To win the battle, it was first necessary to join it. The forces with the task of defending the square were plainly inadequate. Colonel Romero had barely a few thousand men, either from rear battalions of dubious quality or from troops on the retreat since the opening of the nationalist offensive, who could not be expected to have remarkable morale. Moreover, the Asaltos deserted the front on the morning of January 21st. Finally, the population of the town was not prepared for genuine resistance. Excluding those in sympathy with nationalism, the vast majority of the inhabitants were clearly worn out and had stopped believing in the victory they had waited for so long. Survival had become the main problem in Barcelona. Everything was in short supply. There was no more coal or electricity. The shops were empty. Even on the black market, scarcity was the rule. Government deliveries were irregular and too small. Markets stopped receiving supplies. Sugar was replaced by saccharin. There was practically no oil. Only bread was not short, except during the 3 days before the city's capture. But 300 grams of gray bread did not satisfy hunger. The city's desolate look, in contrast to the gaiety and color of the early days of the revolution on the Ramblas, showed how far things had gone. Places of entertainment closed their doors, first nightclubs and dance halls. Then, after January 14th, theaters, cinemas, and even cafes, where people sat out of sheer habit. The last shops had closed their iron shutters. Barcelona 48 hours before the entry of the enemy, said Rojo, is like a city of the dead. The last line of defense protecting the city was the Tibidabo mountain range. It was not seriously defended. On the 23rd, the Llobregat front was breached. In 3 days, disobedience and desertion were rife. On the morning of the 26th, there was an almost wholesale stampede. The heroic devotion of a few groups, which were massacred on the spot, was completely pointless. The port area was bombed by nationalist aircraft, artillery, and warships. The troops of Solchaga and Yagali that converged on the city occupied the military districts on the outskirts. In the early afternoon, tanks appeared at the harbor. By evening, all resistance had ceased. The actual occupation of the town had cost the nationalists only a single life. The capital's last defenders had withdrawn, mainly anxious not to be outflanked to the north. On January 23rd, Negrin and his government, the embassies, and the ministries had left Barcelona. However, it had not been possible to evacuate everything. Part of the archives had been destroyed. And when the nationalists had entered the city, they had not found it void of its inhabitants. Many, like the former town clerk, had preferred to wait for the victors. The city's new mayor, Miguel Matufai, president of the Hispano-Suiza Company, was soon able to restore the essential services. The most difficult thing was to reorganize food supplies. The loss of Barcelona was not of enormous strategic importance to the Republicans, but the unconditional surrender of the Catalonian capital had a decisive effect on the morale of the population throughout Republican Spain. The death throes of the Republic began that day. The flight toward the frontier, the collapse of the front, and the rumors that accompany every catastrophe drove onto the roads a horde of refugees who were heading in disorder for all the French frontier crossings. According to Le Temps on February 6, 100,000 had already crossed it. Rojo estimated those thronging the border posts at some hundreds of thousands. "It is chaos," he said, mingled with the civilian population fleeing the nationalist advance. A wretched crowd encumbered with a few belongings were thousands of soldiers who had deserted the fighting area. They added to the panic by peddling the most unlikely rumors. Armed men commandeered cars and then abandoned them at the frontier. There was no longer any law and order or police, only total anarchy. It was the chaos of defeat and despair. But why shouldn't the crowd have taken to its heels? Since the end of January, not a day had gone by without a report of some well-known figure crossing into France: Giral, Caballero, and Araquistan. These facts were common knowledge and, in the general panic, were even grossly exaggerated. The French authorities were overwhelmed by the mass of fugitives. To begin with, they had admitted the refugees, but very soon it had become impossible to register tens of thousands of refugees and disperse them about the country. On January 30th, the French authorities decided not to let able-bodied men cross for a while and to grant right of asylum only to women and children. The men who had already crossed the frontier and had not yet been directed to a particular place were massed in a detention camp at Argils, in the Pyrenees-Orientals. At the time, this decision sowed fresh panic among the Spaniards who were waiting at the frontier posts in Perthus and Boulou. Some of the fugitives streamed back into still unoccupied Catalonia. Others tried to enter France by stealth, and many succeeded, in spite of the presence of Senegalese troops with the task of surveillance. This situation merely complicated the task of the French authorities. Also, from 5 to February 9th, the frontier was once again officially open to Spanish soldiers. Rojo had promised that crossings of the frontier would be made in good order. In fact, although a stampede by some elements proved unavoidable, it is only fair to point out, because it was a success that testified, amid general anarchy, to the real worth of these troops, that the last armed contingents to cross the frontier had retreated in good order. French journalists noted that their morale was better and that they did not have the look of a routed army. Among them were 700 of the surviving members of the international brigades, who had remained in Catalonia until the last moment and crossed the frontier only on February 7th. According to the agreements reached with the Republican General Staff, once the men had crossed the frontier, they were no longer regarded as soldiers, but as refugees. They were disarmed, underwent a formal search, and were immediately sent on to assembly centers, the chief of which was still at Argils. The latter soon proved inadequate to take in everyone. Another had to be created not far away. In Saint-Cyprien, war material was confiscated by the French government. Though some Spanish leaders were under the illusion that they could transport such equipment to the Central Zone, they were soon obliged to bow to the facts. If the Central Zone went on fighting, it would do so with its own forces. During the final days, the leaders of the Republic had crossed the frontier too. President Azafia arrived in France on the morning of February 5th, 3 days after the remaining members of the government and Negrin himself. But differences were already emerging between the President of the Republic and the head of the government on what attitude was to be adopted after the loss of Catalonia. Negrin and his staff had striven to maintain some slight order and discipline. They may have contemplated a degree of resistance in the extreme north of the country, around Girona and Figueres, relying on the French frontier. But it was difficult to imagine that a regular front could be held by troops that were melting away daily. The information services had stopped functioning. Though the advance of the nationalist troops could be contained in the mountainous sector, it had not ceased along the coast. The command itself did not seem up to its task, and it had been necessary to replace it in the final days. General Jurado took over from Sarabia at the head of what remained of the group of armies. In spite of all its efforts to maintain discipline, the General Staff could not avoid localized panic. Units of carabineros and security forces, incorporated in the army, had given the signal for a stampede. The steps that had been taken in Figueres to try to organize the retreating troops were nothing but totally inadequate palliatives, air raids, and the fear of a nationalist landing in the rear contrived to make any organization of defense impracticable. The ministerial meetings that Negrin held in Figueres no longer had any rhyme or reason. What was the point of decisions that could not be carried out? What had disappeared or had become unusable was not the government, but the organs of the government and the executive. The small towns of Figueres and Girona could not shelter them. There was not even room there to set up offices. The arrival of processions of official cars merely brought the traffic to a standstill. Many Barcelona officials, who no longer had the least confidence in the outcome of the war, had not even waited for orders from the government to make for the frontier. In short, though there was still a government, the state had already ceased to exist. On February 8, the General Staff moved to Perthus, and on the 9th Rojo crossed to Boulou in French territory. The same day, at 1:50 p.m., the Nationalists reached the frontier at Perthus. The remaining organized Republican troops crossed into France on the 9th and the 10th of February. There was no longer any army of Catalonia. The capitulation of Minorca at the same time. The capitulation of Minorca introduced a new element, British mediation. The island had been completely isolated since nationalist Spain had showed its naval superiority. On February 8, the English cruiser Devonshire brought a nationalist representative, Colonel San Luis, to Port Mahon. An initial meeting took place between the governor of Minorca, González Ubieda, and the captain of the Devonshire, Muirhead Gould. Ubieda agreed to work out the lines along which a surrender could be negotiated with Colonel San Luis. During the course of 2 meetings, which the commander of the Devonshire attended, the 2 sides agreed that the lives of the Republican officers and officials should be spared and that the evacuation of those who wished to escape nationalist domination would be guaranteed. The Devonshire took on board 300 men, 100 women, and 50 children. Yet everything nearly fell through at the last moment, as a result of a nationalist air raid that took place on February 9, after the Port Mahon Agreement. This was regarded as a betrayal on the part of the nationalists. The nationalist base in Palma described this raid as a mistake. This was doubtful. The base at Palma was, in spite of its Spanish command, controlled by the Italians, hostile to any agreement made under the aegis of Great Britain. Indeed, the British radio denied that the British government had taken part in an agreement and stated that the commander of the Devonshire had acted on his own initiative, while Jordana told the German ambassador that there had been no Anglo-Spanish agreement over Minorca. But these were diplomatic statements. Great Britain was obviously not proud of an intervention that could be regarded as an interference in Spanish affairs, and the nationalists set too much store by the Italian-German alliance openly to displease the governments of those countries. But the Minorca agreements were significant. After the fall of Catalonia, the end of the war was in sight. The Negrin government and the problem of peace. In the middle of the disaster there arose the basic problem of peace, which was a political problem. On February the Cortes, or what remained of it, had met in Figueres. Negrin had put to them in no uncertain manner the possibility of a restoration of the peace. But with a defeated army and a state in the process of breaking up, there was no longer any question of negotiation between equals. In spite of their moderation, the 13 points that Negrin had set out as his minimum program in 1938 were now superseded. There were only 3 points that he still considered as conditions for peace: the guarantee of independence and national integrity, the guarantee of freedom for the Spanish people to choose its destiny, the guarantee that a policy of authority would put a stop to persecutions after the war. It was still obvious that it would be difficult, in negotiations, to obtain satisfaction on the second point. Negrin did not seem to wish to confine himself to a simple statement of these conditions. For the first time, British mediation was officially considered by the Republican government. Del Valle told how a meeting had taken place in Aguilana between the British charge, Stevenson, the French ambassador, Jules Henry, Negrin, and himself. During the course of this meeting, Negrin had explained what the 3 guarantees meant to him. Negrin conceded that they could be dropped during the course of negotiations. Even if an approval in principle was received from the Burgos government, it would have little chance of being respected afterward. All that then remained was the third condition, which Del Valle interpreted with the help of this concise formula: no reprisals. It was difficult to be more conciliatory. Rojo seemed to confirm what Del Valle had said when he referred to ending the war in the most dignified way and saving the largest number of people. But there was already a word in Rojo's text that pointed to the growing dissension between the army and the premier. The general was actually referring to a future political formula. It may be that he was in fact agreed on preparing a capitulation by removing those who presented an obstacle to peace. Negrin, on the other hand, intended to hold government-to-government negotiations, which Franco would never accept. In the event of negotiations breaking down, Negrin gave the order to resist. "What shall we resist with? Why are we going to resist?" asked Rojo. In effect, for many of the soldiers, the war was over. Lutemps on February 9th referred to the choice made by the officers in Azana's military bureau. They had decided to join nationalist Spain. Any entente between the military leaders, who acknowledged defeat, and the government, which was still contemplating resistance, was impossible. Chapter 22. The Casado Junta and the Winding Up of the Republic. The fall of Catalonia stirred up antagonisms, hatreds, and jealousies, as had occurred months earlier in the defeated cities of Malaga, Bilbao, and Barcelona. Advocates of resistance and capitulation were at each other's throats. People snatched at any means of flight. There were mutual accusations of the wish for futile slaughter and attempts at betrayal. The Republican officers were hoping that those in the opposite camp would act mildly toward them and contemplated the possibility of an honorable surrender. Foreign agents, members of the Fifth Column, wove intrigues. Eventually, a struggle took place between those who were still talking of resistance and those who wanted immediate peace. No period of the Civil War produced a more copious and questionable supply of literature, memoirs, accusations, polemics, and special pleading. Paradoxically, the task of the historian is complicated by the abundance of material too obviously destined for him. Many of the witnesses seem primarily concerned with saving their own skins and their future political careers. The Negrin government in France henceforth, the fate of Republican territory was debated not in Spain but in France, at the Spanish consulate in Toulouse, where the Negrin government had sought asylum after the rout in Catalonia. President Azafia, like his entourage, no longer believed in the possibility of prolonging the struggle, and it was in vain that Negrin stepped up his efforts to persuade him that it was his duty to return with him to Spain. The government's absence did in fact have a lot to do with the demoralization. Such interminable discussions only confirmed the feeling in Republican Spain that all was lost. In fact, the situation was worsening daily. Incessant bombing raids were terrorizing the urban populations. The problem of food supplies had reached tragic proportions. Many people were trying desperately to find a way out of the trap of the central southern zone. The problem of evacuation was on top of the list of government tasks. Negrin devoted part of his activities to it in Toulouse. Mexico offered to take in 30,000 families. Lord Halifax promised British aid to evacuate the threatened refugees. The Mid-Atlantic Company signed a contract for the lease of the 150,000 tons of shipping in its transport fleet. 2 government commissions were permanently engaged on both aspects of the problem: means of transport and the persons to be evacuated. However, the Negrin government did not regard evacuation as the most urgent task. At dramatic meetings of the Toulouse cabinet, the Premier, Del Valle, and the Communists imposed their point of view. With or without Azafia, the government was to return to Spain to organize last-ditch resistance there. Why this decision? No doubt, according to Segundo Blanco, the government is doing what it can, no more and no less. In fact, Franco did not wish to negotiate with it. He had refused to parley on the basis of Negrin's 3 points. There was therefore nothing for it but to resist. This alone could induce the nationalists to moderate their demands and to talk, as the British so earnestly wished. Resistance was the only way of avoiding unconditional surrender. This was what Alvarez de Veo was attempting to prove. To him, Negrin and his friends obviously no longer believed in an imminent military victory but considered that the armed forces in the central southern zone were sufficient to go on resisting for a few months. Even if Madrid fell, the Republican troops could hold out for a long while in the southeastern mountainous sector. According to them, war had been inevitable in Europe ever since Munich. Could still save the Republic by providing her with allies. Even admitting that this theory was correct, the most difficult task remained, convincing the Spanish themselves of the possibility and necessity of resistance. The ministers present in Toulouse agreed to return, except for Giral. But Azafia remained in Paris and replied to Álvarez de Veo, "No one believes in our ability to resist, and those who believe in it least are our own generals." He resigned on March 2nd. His legitimate successor, Martínez Barrio, the president of the Cortes, would not grant Negrin legal ratification of his premiership and refused to return to Spain. The government's return to Spain on his arrival at the Los Llanos airport. Negrin summoned the military leaders. This conference was to help him assess the difficulties of the mission that he had undertaken. After his statement, all the military leaders except Miaja declared that from now on resistance was impossible. They had to negotiate to avoid disaster. In addition to the demoralization of the rear and of the soldiers, Negrin was faced with a new obstacle to his policy, the defeatism of the army leaders, as it had been expressed for several months through the political activities of the commander of the Army of the Center, Colonel Casado. A long-standing Republican officer and former commander of the Presidential Guard, Casado was one of the professional soldiers who made up Largo Caballero's general staff. He was regarded as a man of the left and had connections with certain socialists and anarchists, but he remained an officer, convinced of the importance of his mission as a soldier, and persuaded that he was respected in the enemy camp. He was very hostile to the Communist Party and felt that it was the excess of communist commands that had led the Western democracies to abandon the Republic. As a soldier, he considered resistance out of the question. Franco would not negotiate as long as Negrin, Del Valle, and the communists were dominant in the Republic. They therefore had to be removed in order to obtain an honorable peace. Casado was convinced that the advocates of negotiation would benefit from British support as soon as communist influence had disappeared. It was necessary, he told Negrin, to obtain Azafia's return and to form a new government of Republicans and Socialists, but excluding the Communist Party. In fact, at that date it had already been several weeks since he had made certain political contacts with a view to overthrowing the government. Among the anarchists, he had close ties with Cipriano Mera, who had command of an army corps, and with Garcia Pradas, whose hostility to the Communist Party had never wavered. Naturally, the CNT continued to support Negrin, for whom Segundo Blanco became spokesman within the libertarian movement. But the hostility of the FAI prevailed at a meeting of the Liaison Committee of the CNT-FAI Libertarian Youth, who asked on February 25th for the formation of a new government or a new defense junta. Of the socialists, Caballero's friend Wenceslao Carrillo was also in on the colonel's plans and approved of them. He mustered his friends in Madrid in order to try to wrest the leadership of the Socialist Party and the UGT from Negrin's supporters who had remained close to him in France. After their return, he stepped up his attacks on González Pifia. Another socialist lent his support to the Casado movement. Julian Bastero was neither a militant nor a man of action, but the incarnation of Republican socialism. Classed on the extreme right of the Socialist Party, this university professor had played no important role since the beginning of the war. He had been regarded as a man of compromise ever since Azafia had given him the task of seeking a basis for mediation in London. He was HIGWY regarded in London and Paris. Finally, Casado had undoubtedly been in touch with foreign diplomats, especially British ones. Dominguez said that he had frequent contacts with Cowan, who seems to have been the actual instigator of the plot, even advising the colonel in the choice of his collaborators. Hidalgo de Cisneros told Del Valle that the colonel had dropped hints to him about British promises. The Negrin government was acquainted with the situation and the dangers inherent in it. It tried both to win over and intimidate its obviously vacillating enemies. Behind Negrin was the substantial power of the Communist Party, its military units, and its police force. But the anarchists wanted to wring concessions from Negrin and to persuade him to share certain responsibilities with them. According to them, the government that was installed somewhere in Republican Spain had in fact been reduced to the Negrin del Valle Uribe triumvirate. They regarded as a provocation its appointment of the leader of the CIM, Garces, to the head of the commission that was to select the people to be evacuated. They insisted that control of the evacuation operations should not remain in the hands of Negrin and Veo, and expressed the fear that senior officials would be evacuated first. On March 3rd, they were still hoping to take part in organizing the evacuation and put forward one of their own men, González Entrialgo, for the vital post of commander of the naval base at Cartagena. On several occasions, they repeated to Negrin that they were not eager to see communist power increase through the allocation of new commands. On March 2nd, Negrin had made his choice, and the cabinet confirmed a series of promotions and transfers in the high command. Casado was appointed a general but replaced at the head of the Army of the Center by the communist Modesto, also promoted to general. Miaja was honorably retired with the title of Inspector General of the Army. The creation of mobile shock units, intended to reform fighting methods, was accompanied by promotions of communist officers. Lister, Gallon, and Marquez were appointed colonels. The communists eventually received command of the ports Vega and Alicante, Tagifia and Murcia, and most important Francisco Paco Gallon in Caragena, a post coveted by everyone which gave him the upper hand over what remained of the fleet. To those who accused him of having thus carried out an actual coup d'état and handing power over to the communists, Negrin replied that, since the government had decided on resistance, its duty was to appoint advocates of resistance to positions of command. The preponderance of communists was merely a reflection of their wholehearted adherence to Negrin's policy. But to the government's enemies, the measures adopted had only one meaning. From now on it was the Communist Party that had sole control of the evacuation and that alone held power. A new civil war? The reshuffles decided by the government were badly received. Not only the military technicians, but the party and union cadres and a large part of the population regarded it as a seizure by a party whose actions had aroused great hatred and resentment. This was an unexpected opportunity for the conspirators, who thereby showed their antagonism toward a communist coup d'état and to a pointless continuation of the war with its massacres and its sufferings. Increasing irritation with this government of the defeated, after 3 years of civil war, was to provoke an explosion of anger against Negrin. The anarchists and left-wing socialists who had had to relinquish their revolutionary ambitions were at last enjoying their revenge on the party of law and order. Senior officials and regular officers were quick to seize the opportunity for an honorable peace. They were hoping for a compromise by which Franco would acknowledge their standing in the social hierarchy. The party and union leaders wanted guarantees that they would be able to leave the country. The mass of the population, which no longer had faith in anything, turned on those who wanted to accumulate pointless suffering and on the privileged members of the new authority. It had one desire: to put an end to the war as quickly as possible. There were vague hopes that Franco would be more disposed to clemency once the communists had been removed. Nationalist agents, growing in numbers daily, caused friction. The first trouble broke out in Cartagena, amid total confusion. Admiral Biza had already informed Negrin that the fleet would leave the country if he did not decide to negotiate. In spite of a special journey by Paulino Gómez, the Minister of the Interior, with the task of preparing the ground beforehand, Gallon's appointment caused an explosion. Part of the garrison revolted under a senior artillery officer, Colonel Armentia, and challenged the instatement of the new commander. The Phalangists, mixing with the insurgents, seized the radio station and put out false rumors the fleet took to sea to avoid falling into their hands. Yet the uprising failed. Colonel Armentia, after much hesitation, surrendered and then took his life. The 10th Division, under the Communist de Frutos, marched on Cartagena. Within a few hours, the Communist Rodriguez, at the head of the 11th Brigade, had crushed the uprising. But the fleet did not return, finally deciding, on the injunction of the French Admiralty, to head for Bizerta, where the crews were interned. Thus one of the means of evacuation disappeared. The government seemed to be panic-stricken. Hernandez, the Commissar General, hit back on his own initiative. Meanwhile, in Madrid, the situation took a sudden turn for the worse. Casado had in fact made up his mind. Informed by Gómez Osorio, governor of Madrid, as to the tenor of the decrees, he immediately got in touch with the parties and set up a defense committee in which he himself would represent the armed forces. Menendez in the Levant was in agreement with him, and so was Matalana. Miaja joined the movement, adding his prestige to it. Garcia Pradas drew up the Revolutionaries' Manifesto. Pedrero of the CIM and the socialist Geranta, Director General of the Security Police, were in the plot. Mera brought the support of the 4th Army Corps and the socialist Francisco Castro that of a brigade of carabineros. Nearly all the Asalto officers joined in. The Casado junta meeting in the cellars of the Ministry of Finance. The conspirators spent the evening of the 5th waiting for the coup d'état. The 90th Brigade, led by the anarchist Bernabe Lopez, occupied the capital's strategic points. When his men had completed their moves, the proclamation of the junta was broadcast over the radio. Estero spoke first and asked the Negrin government to stand down. The Army of the Republic, with indisputable authority, is undertaking the settlement of a very serious problem, basically a military one. Criticizing Negrin's policy, he accused him of merely seeking to gain time, in the morbid belief that the growing complication of international events will lead to a catastrophe of universal proportions. He asked all Spaniards to support the legitimate government of the Republic, which is, for the time being, nothing but the army. Casado then addressed Spaniards beyond the trenches. He offered the choice, either peace for Spain or a fight to the death. Mera said that the junta's mission was to obtain an honorable peace based on justice and brotherhood. Then the composition of the junta was announced. General Miaja as president, Estero as foreign minister, Casado as minister of defense, Carrillo as minister of the interior, and Eduardo Val as minister of communications. Another anarchist, González, Marin, survivor of the 1937 junta, Antonio Perez of the UGT, and the Republican San Andres and José del Rio completed the lineup, of which the syndicalist Sánchez Requena was appointed secretary. All the Popular Front unions and parties were represented in it, with the exception of the Communist Party. The Negrin government, which was in Elda in total isolation, protected by a detachment of 80 soldiers led by communist officers, embarked on a discussion on March 5 that lasted until the evening of the 6th. On paper, it still possessed considerable means. 3 out of the 4 Army Corps of the center were commanded by communists: Barcelo, Bueno, and Ortega. Similarly, in the Levant there were 3 Army Corps to challenge Menendez, 3 divisions in Estremadura, and communist officers in all the units. In spite of this, Negrin did not attempt to resist. He made a solemn appeal to Casado in order to avoid bloodshed and offered to appoint delegates to resolve all differences. Casado replied by threatening to have all the members of the government shot if General Matalana, detained in Elda, was not released within 3 hours. As the communist officers took up arms in Madrid against the junta, the government left Spain. Negrin and Álvarez del Valle took the plane for France. With them went the communist leaders, political ones such as La Pasionaria and Uribe, and military ones such as Lister, Modesto, Hidalgo de Cisneros, and Núñez Mazas. But the government's flight did not prevent the bloodshed that it had seemed anxious to avoid. In Madrid, Major Ascanio, at the head of the 8th Army Corps, he had taken over from Bueno, who was sick, tried to sever the capital, to the north, from the rest of Republican Spain. A 3-sided struggle now ensued, with the nationalists exploiting the situation, and the communists and Casadists accusing each other, justifiably it would seem, of neglecting the front in order to settle old scores. On the 7th, Barcelo seized Casado's headquarters, where he was attacked by Mera. On the 10th, Colonel Ortega, suspect in the eyes of the junta, surrendered to Casado's troops. As a result of his mediation, negotiations were opened between the Communist Party, represented by Dieguez, and Casado. The Communist Party asked for a guarantee of freedom for its militants and its press, and for a communist to join the junta. Casado agreed in principle not to indulge in reprisals but shot Lieutenant Colonel Barcelo and the Communist Commissar Conisa, whom he held responsible for the execution, after the capture of his headquarters, of several officers, including Colonels Gazzolo and Otero. On the 12th, a Communist Party leaflet called for an end to fratricidal strife. Not only are we giving up all resistance to the constituted authority, but the communists at the front, in the rear, and in their working and fighting posts, will continue to set an example of self-abnegation and sacrifice, and of heroism and discipline. This week of civil war had caused 2,000 deaths. Yet there had not been any real fighting except around Madrid. In the Levant, troops loyal to Menendez had had several clashes with Major Sendent's armor, which was standing by to sever communications with Madrid. But the 45th Division, on the junta's orders, had occupied the Communist Party's offices and had arrested its leaders. The Republican Julio just negotiated the settlement between Casidists and Communists. In Extremadura, the Communists Terrell and Martinez Carton were in a state of readiness. The only serious incidents had occurred at Ciudad Real, where the governor, Antana, shelled a Communist Party building and arrested Mangata, in spite of his membership in the junta. All in all, there was nothing to show that the Communist Party wished to get rid of the Casado junta. Only the units led by Ascanio had attacked Casidist troops. Elsewhere, troops led by Communists had been content to defend themselves. The efforts of Castro Delgado and Jesus Hernandez in Valencia had been in vain. The departure of the Communist General Staff on March 6 proved that the Communist Party had backed down and that it too now regarded defeat as inevitable. Togliatti, Checa, and Clandin of the JSU, who had stayed on in Spain after the 6th, had been arrested and then released on the orders of General Hernandez Sarabia. Their only mission seems to have been that of evacuating the cadres. A group of about 50 militants took off on March 25 from a small airport near Cartagena. Failure of negotiations for an honorable peace this civil war had had at least one result, that of compromising once and for all the fulfillment of the objective common to both sides. Negrin's friends had in fact even noted that the Casado junta had merely taken over the premier's policy, minus the chances of putting it into practice, because it had given up blackmail over the protraction of the fighting. Casado supporters then retorted that it was the communist uprising that had dealt a mortal blow to the slender possibilities of resistance. Be that as it may, the fact remains that it was no longer possible. At any rate, its internal struggles over, the junta had a free hand to negotiate. It proposed to do so on the following grounds. 1. Affirmation of national integrity and sovereignty. 2. Respect for all combatants whose motives were sincere and honorable. 3. Guarantees that there would be no reprisals apart from normal trials, and that political offenses would be distinguished from common law ones. 4. Respect for the lives and liberties of soldiers, militiamen, and commissars who had not committed any criminal acts. 5. Respect for the lives, liberties, and careers of professional soldiers. 6. Same guarantees for officials. 7. 25 days grace for anyone wishing to leave Spain freely. 8. No Italian or Moroccan soldiers in former Republican Spain. These were clearly extravagant claims, given the circumstances in which they were formulated. The most important part of the document was the request for guarantees for soldiers and officials. It amounted to sealing a reconciliation between enemies of the same class over the heads of the combatants. But, on the whole, the junta was in for disillusion after disillusion. It wanted negotiations. Franco wanted a capitulation. It wanted a treaty. Franco did not wish to sign anything. There was an initial affront. Franco's plenipotentiary was a Republican officer from the Army of the Center, a subordinate of Casado's, who momentarily considered having him shot, Colonel Santafios. He knew, before Casado handed it to him, the text of the memorandum. Second affront. Franco refused to negotiate with Casado and Maddalena. He was interested only in surrender and insisted on dealing with lower-ranking officers. Casado gave way and selected 2 staff officers, Major Leopoldo Ortega and Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Garijo, attached to Miaja for many years, but whom Franco later rewarded for services rendered to the national cause. On March 23, the 2 plenipotentiaries were in Burgos. Their proposals were not even studied. Franco wanted the Air Force to surrender on the 25th and the whole of the rest of the army on the 27th. His representatives, Colonels Ungria, Director General of the Security Police, and Vittoria made several verbal promises. Application of the Code of Justice, no political reprisals, and the opportunity for some to leave the country. The junta's reactions were violent. Carrillo said that the Republicans could not accept anything without a written text. Estero retorted, "I did not come here to pursue the war." Carrillo added, "Nor I to betray." On the 25th, Ortega and Garijo, again in Burgos, hoped to convince their opposites that the junta could go no further. But an order from Franco broke off negotiations. The Air Force had not surrendered as he had requested. The junta had its back to the wall. Certain anarchists wanted to resist. The military were against it. Casado thought that he could evacuate Madrid in 3 days. On the 26th, The junta announced to Franco that the Air Force would surrender on the 27th and asked for the date of the capitulation to be decided. Franco's laconic reply brooked no response. The nationalist troops were about to attack. The Republican troops were to fly the white flag and carry out a spontaneous surrender, following as closely as possible instructions provided by the nationalist envoys, with the soldiers assembled in brigades after surrendering their arms. There was no need of a government for this sort of capitulation. Moreover, the junta no longer was one. The Republican state had been dissolved. No police official had been found to obey the order to arrest the Falangist Valdez, released since the beginning of March in Madrid. In the succeeding hours, all that the advisors could do was to try to complete the evacuation as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. Our preoccupation, the junta stated during the night following the 26th, is the evacuation from Republican Spain of citizens who have to leave the country. The governors were invited to issue safe conducts to all threatened citizens. The junta asked for ships from abroad, especially from London and Paris. But the breakup was too far gone for this final operation to be carried out. The ships booked by Negrin did not come, on the excuse that advance payments had not been made, and the Mid-Atlantic handed over its contract to Burgos. London and Paris stood idly by, while 45,000 persons were crammed together in Alicante, a single French boat left with 40 passengers. There was no longer any army or any authority. From 27 to March 30th, there was a mad dash to the sea by all who had remained till the last moment and were trying to escape from the enemy. The junta held its last meeting on the evening of the 27th. Everything was over. Carrillo and some other councillors left for Valencia during the night. Casado, who had wanted to control the evacuation of Madrid in the days to come, finally went ahead of them by plane. Bands of young men were sporting nationalist emblems and chanting Franco's name in the streets. What was left of authority in Republican Spain was taken up with ensuring the peaceful transfer of power, as in Valencia, where the council members were dealing with a representative of the fifth column. Casado announced this agreement on the radio to try to obtain calm. On the evening of the 29th, General Miaja left Spain. Casado and the remaining council members around him took passage, after long discussions on the Galatea, an English warship. The nationalists made no attempt to stop them, but they arrested Bastero, who had stayed in Madrid, and Sanchez Requena in Valencia. Here and there, a few hundred combatants were killed or took their own lives. A few 100,000 had abandoned the front, but the vast majority were eventually captured. Franco's domination spread to the whole of Spain. The civil war was ended. Epilogue. It is impossible to give the exact number of refugees who had left the Central Zone in the second fortnight of March for France and North America. In his indictment of Casado, Álvarez del Valle said that only 2,000 had left, whereas 30,000 should have been able to do so, but his argument was based on the assumption that the Negrin government enjoyed an authority superior to the Casado juntas, which is doubtful. The aid that the Republicans needed ought to have been both rapid and massive. The French and British governments had not responded as was hoped to the appeals from Madrid. The French government in particular, which had already welcomed Basque and Catalan refugees, now acted very reticent. Few French ships responded to the appeal by the Republicans. Many men had to take flight at the last moment with whatever means came to hand. Exile. The terrible ordeal of exile for all these refugees now began. In North America and in France, they were interned in camps where they endured very harsh moral and physical conditions while awaiting the welcome of a foreign country or authorization to remain in France. Though unenthusiastic and even ill-mannered, the French authorities nevertheless granted the exile that the defeated Republicans asked them for. They did not exercise any political discrimination. But in the Second World War, a large proportion of the refugees found themselves back in camps. The Pétain government agreed to hand them over to Germany. Several thousand Spaniards thus endured deportation and death camps. Others, more numerous, especially in the southwest, took part in the resistance with the French Maquisards. However, the United States, the majority of whose population had condemned the nationalists, only accepted a very small batch of refugees. Equally, the USSR was cruelly disillusioning to its Spanish supporters. The Russian government did indeed agree to take in a large number of them, but although it offered certain leaders of the Spanish Communist Party privileged living conditions, the rest, finding themselves in new living conditions, in a country alien both in language and spirit, ran into great difficulties. Not only did they not find in the Russia of 1939 the paradise promised by their leaders, but they were often dispersed, isolated, and settled in working conditions made even more irksome by the climate, hard for Mediterraneans to endure. The evidence that we have about their fate may be suspect of partiality because it originates from former communists who had broken with their party. It nevertheless explains the disenchantment that, for some, turned to systematic hostility and refueled the dissensions of exile. Such uneasy welcomes, the result of selfish or vindictive motives, only heightened the goodwill and generosity shown by the Mexican government, which opened its frontiers liberally to all who wished to seek refuge in that country. With exile came the age of controversy. Certainly, the Republican parties had long since given up hiding their differences. At least they had pretended, while the war had lasted, to believe in unity during a struggle against a common enemy, nationalism. With defeat, this bond had disappeared. On the contrary, politicians and soldiers found themselves faced with a disaster that they had to explain. It was a time of justification. Censorship and the concern to prevent the enemy from exploiting dissension in the Republican camp had concealed many differences from the general public, but defeat disposed of scruples of this order, and discussions among the former allies became bitter, even within the parties themselves, which suffered comparatively deep and lasting rifts with emigration. Quarrels between émigrés are always painful. In this case at least they were explained by the persistence of illusions about the democracies among most of the political leaders in exile and the hopes nurtured over the years of bringing about the collapse of Franco Spain from outside. Of course, neither the political activities of governments in exile nor even the guerrillas who held out or were still turning up several years after the end of the Civil War in themselves justified their faith in the future of emigration. But everyone knew that after the World War, the Western powers, if they had wanted, could have overthrown Franco, to whom military victory had been only the beginning of serious political and economic difficulties. Spain after the war, be that as it may, in March 1939 all that remained of Republican Spain was occupied within a week. Franco had announced an offensive for March 26, but he was no longer confronted by an organized force. There was no longer a fight but a simple occupation of abandoned positions. The nationalists could have made an immediate entry into Madrid. They had waited several hours to lend greater solemnity to the taking over of the city. In Madrid, symbol of Republican resistance and the restored capital of Spain, the victory procession took place along the Paseo de la Castellana. Honor was rendered to the German and Italian allies, whose troops were at the head of the procession. Moreover, everywhere the occupation went off without difficulty, to the accompaniment of cheers and religious ceremonies. The Caudillo had not made the conciliatory gestures that some of those in the enemy camp had expected from him. Repression had not ceased with his victory. On the contrary, the application of the law on political responsibility and the establishment of war councils throughout the whole of former Republican Spain strengthened reactionary measures. Arrests and sentences multiplied. It was a question, according to Chano, of a serious and most rigorous purge. Modernism was not regarded as a mitigating circumstance. Bestero, who had intended to spare Spain violence, was himself sentenced to 30 years' imprisonment. Tens of thousands of prisoners attested to the power of the new state over the years. The army, the police, and the Falangist militia ensured the stability of a strong regime. Everyone was inculcated with a hatred of the Red Revolution and even of a liberal system condemned by the Church. Although certain Falangists preserved the hope of one day seeing the triumph of the National Socialist regime, which would perhaps mean social progress, and although certain liberals went so far through hostility to the regime as to hope for the coming of the monarchy, even if all the signs indicated that it would preserve an absolutist character, the true victors, and this became clearer daily, were the army and the Church. Acción Católica had in fact wasted no time in recovering all its power. After having been content to support the system from outside, it had agreed to take part in the government. It was true that there had several times been question of a liberalization of the regime, that the frontiers had been easier to cross, and that a certain number of political exiles had been able to return. But in its essentials, the system remained immutable. This was because the regime, product of the purest political conservatism, had been unable to resolve its economic problems. Insolvent and impoverished, Spain had, during the war, lost part of the livestock that made up her wealth. In 1939, only 60% of the horses, 72% of the mules, and 73% of the oxen remained of the ones that had been there in 1935. With crops, there was a fall in production, calculated on the same years, of about 30% for corn, 35% for barley, tobacco, and olives, and 65% for beetroot. Although the production of maize had increased, this was because it had been an exceptionally good year. The drop in essential goods was spectacular and corresponded to a falling off in the acreage under cultivation. In spite of the efforts made by both sides in support of industry, production had fallen off too, especially in textiles. Even mining production had dropped in the case of iron, copper, lead, and zinc. The apparent prosperity of nationalist Spain had melted away as Franco's government had been forced to take control of the overpopulated and undernourished regions of Barcelona, Madrid, and the Levant. After the fall of Barcelona, difficulties began over food supplies. The white bread of the war years was replaced by gray. Spain had to obtain part of her food supplies from outside. But how was this agricultural country now to live? Moreover, the Franco regime was trying to practice autarky like the USSR and Germany. However, what was possible, at the cost of considerable sacrifices, for the great powers, was no longer so in the 20th century for an underdeveloped country like Spain. In spite of the privations imposed, the maintenance of an extremely low subsistence level, and intensive propaganda about the Spanish fatherland and the Iberian Empire, General Franco's government soon had a choice of only two directions: either to follow Germany and Italy and to couple Spain's fate with theirs, or to try and win the friendship of certain Western powers, Great Britain in particular. On the one hand, there was the question of gratitude for aid received during the Civil War, the community of ideology, and the eventual satisfaction of certain political ambitions. On the other hand, the need for peace and Portugal's Anglophile influence. The commitments made by Franco at the end of the conflict seemed to prove that he had now opted for alliance with fascism and Nazism. Membership in the Anti-Comintern Pact was the guarantee for it. The part played by Suner in Spain's foreign policy seems, in spite of the reservations that the Germans may have had about him, to be proof of the highly Germanophile orientation of nationalist policy. But, shortly after the Civil War, incidents occurred indicating the limits that the Caudillo meant to impose on his international ventures. There had been fruitless attempts to organize a meeting between Goering and Franco, and the failure of this project was the source, soon after the common victory, of initial tension between the two countries. Later on, the meeting between Franco and Hitler, after the German victory in France, came as a fresh deception to the Nazi chancellor. Clearly, Suner's opinions had not changed, and Spain remained sympathetic to a German victory, but the dispatch of the Azul Legion to the Eastern Front was the only positive evidence of this bond. Attempts to lure Portugal away from her alliance with Great Britain proved fruitless, and Suner's loss of influence suggested an evolution had taken place. Of course, the Spanish were able to feel that Franco had done his country a favor, soon after an exhausting civil war, by keeping her clear of the world conflict. But undoubtedly the objective in mind had merely been the stability of the regime, finally saved after the war by protection from the victorious Americans. Spain would have been exhausted in any case, no matter who the victors were. The simple-minded may be astonished that, after a civil war fought under the banner of renovation, the fatherland and national independence, Spain was more archaic and even more dependent on others than before, in the face of the 20th century world. Only the army had caught up to some extent through foreign intervention. This did not, however, prevent it from remaining ill-adapted to a modern war. Spain relapsed into her past through the will of the oligarchy and with the complicity of the foreign powers. Chano wrote in his diaries, "Showing the Atlas open at Spain," Mussolini said, "It has been open like this for 3 years. Now it is enough. But I already know that I must open it at another page." The dress rehearsal which was enacted on the Spanish battlefields ended just as the World War was in preparation. Hitler occupied Czechoslovakia and Mussolini was making ready to attack Albania. Shortly afterward, the Hitler-Stalin Pact and the attack on Poland heralded 6 years of World War. Mussolini's fall, the collapse of Hitler's Germany, and fresh revolutionary explosions in one country, in one continent after another. 20 years later, the Caudillo was still building monuments to his glory.